Radio Westeros, Episode 103, Robert's Rebellion, Part 1.
Spoilers all books!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Radio Westeros. I'm Yolkboy, and with me as always is Lady Gwyn.
Hi everyone, today we continue our exploration of the fall of House Targaryen, picking up where we left off at the end of our recent episode about the tourney of Harrenhal in the year of the Fall Spring. Although, if you happen to miss that episode, this one will very much stand on its own. We want to begin by acknowledging, for longtime listeners especially, that while we've written about this subject before, in the context of our Robert Baratheon episode, here we'll be pulling the focus back and looking at things from the viewpoint of House Targaryen and their supporters, as well as all those who joined together to topple the ruling house and the reasons why they did so.
Yeah, we'll look at the big picture sweep of the rebellion as it engulfed much of the realm. Who joined with whom, and who stayed home. But we'll also consider numerous small mysteries, such as why Robert Baratheon was alone in the town of Stony Sept, why Ethan Glover survived the war in order to ride out with Ned at its end, who told Gerald Hightower where his prince could be found, why he and 2 other Kingsguard remained behind when Rhaegar returned to King's Landing, and much more.
In short, we hope to unearth every detail and suggest solutions to every mystery, large and small, that we find. We hope you'll find this to be a much more thorough analysis of this topic than anything we've ever done before. As such, we begin with the disappearance of Lyanna Stark and its aftermath. How did her family and friends react, and what was happening in the Red Keep after the Crown Prince rode off with the daughter of the Warden of the North?
Following that, we'll dive into events as Jon Arryn calls his banners and Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon leave the Eyrie and head to their respective homes to summon their supporters, leading to several of the well-known early battles of the war.
Along the way, we'll cover politics, the rise and fall of Aerys' advisors, and keep an eye on the Mad King's mindset, as well as the strengthening of bonds in the rebel coalition. We'll conclude with the Royalist defeat at the Trident and the subsequent sack of King's Landing. Expect high drama, possible heroism, and tragic deaths, especially in the final segment. The sack of King's Landing was a brutal event, and no one suffered worse than the innocents.
All that said, as we dug into this topic, it became clear that it's much more expansive than we could cover in a single episode, and so today we present part 1 of 2, in which we'll cover everything up to the sack of King's Landing. Part 2 will pick up with Ned heading into the south to lift the siege of Storm's End, and everything that came after that, including a complete wrap-up of the aftermath for all the players we discuss in both episodes.
But before we dive into part 1, we want to thank our patrons, as always, for supporting our continued work of bringing you the best analysis of all things Westerosi in our power. Thanks so much to every one of you, including our Flaming Lightbringer patron, TJ Harrington, our Dragonsteel patrons, Peter, Kevin Wallbank, and Multude, and our Palest Milk Glass patrons, Alex, Aka and the Company of the Cats, Crispy, the Song of Ice, Kelly, Sister Winter, Empty Walls, First of His Name, John Wergarian, and Half Maester Zach, as well as B-Word and Mr. J, the Bear and the Maiden Fair, and Sir Tim of House Jibjab Hot Dog Shop, house motto, we forge the chains we wear in life.
And if you want to support Radio Westeros and earn early access to episodes, exclusive content, and possible shout-outs, please visit our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/Radio Westeros. And now, let's get started with Robert's Rebellion.
Not 10 leagues from Harrenhal, Rhaegar fell upon Lyanna Stark of Winterfell and carried her off, lighting a fire that would consume his house and kin and all those he loved, and half the realm besides.
In our episode about the year of the full spring, we suggested that Lyanna Stark disappeared from the inn at the crossroads, fitting with the canon statement that Rhaegar Targaryen found her not 10 leagues from Harrenhal. We also reiterated our idea that her disappearance was not a kidnapping, but a rescue, saving the young woman from the dangerous attention of King Aerys and his pyromancers following her deception as the Knight of the Laughing Tree at the tourney of Harrenhal.
As a reminder, Rhaegar left Dragonstone to go into the Riverlands, accompanied by 6 companions, at least 2 of whom, the Kingsguards Arthur Dayne and Sir Oswell Went, appear to have remained with the prince once Lyanna was safely in their custody. The other 4 may have returned to King's Landing, or perhaps dispersed on other errands, carrying messages from the prince that may or may not have been delivered, and more on that later.
We don't know what happened next with Rhaegar Targaryen, Lyanna Stark, Arthur Dayne, and Oswell Went. In fact, it would be many months before Rhaegar appeared in the narrative again, and more than a year before the other 3 were found at a fateful watchtower in the Red Mountains of Dorne. And while we will eventually pick up those story threads once again, we must turn our attention elsewhere for now to the reactions of Lyanna Stark's family and friends.
In Catelyn 10 of A Game of Thrones, Cat is in the Whispering Wood where she remembers past moments of waiting for the men in her life as she waits for her son Robb to win his battle. She recalls Brandon Stark leaving Riverrun on some errand, promising her that they would be wed upon his return. "I shall not be long," he had said, almost certainly indicating that his destination was somewhere close by. Piecing together her story from disparate parts of the narrative, as well as the World of Ice and Fire app, it seems as though sometime late in 281 AC, Brandon Stark had fought a duel with Peter Baelish and then departed. We know that Cat never saw Brandon again, and that it was on this errand that Brandon learned that his sister had disappeared with Rhaegar.
We get a little more information about what happened in another Cat chapter in A Clash of Kings, when Catelyn has a very revealing interview with the captive Jaime Lannister. Brandon was returning to Riverrun, she says, when he heard about Lyanna. Evidently, Brandon had met his father, who we learn in Bran 6 of A Game of Thrones, was travelling south with a guard of 200 men for the upcoming wedding at Riverrun. Instead of waiting to find out more, Brandon raced to King's Landing to challenge the prince.
Piecing together all of this information, we must conclude that Lord Rickard and his men then traveled on to Riverrun, though it's never mentioned specifically. Where else could he have gone as they waited for news about Lyanna and now Brandon? And in Clash of Kings, Catelyn only tells Jaime that Hoster Tully had raged and called Brandon a fool, and while she admits that Brandon was rash, we have to wonder what explains Lord Hoster's reaction. Could it have been that a messenger arrived at Riverrun bearing news about what had happened and why?
Yeah, as we'll see, Lord Hoster ultimately had to be convinced to join in the rebellion, and we wonder if he knew more about its causes than Catelyn was aware. Such a message reaching Riverrun might also explain why Rickard Stark doesn't seem to have demanded his daughter's return when he eventually reached the capital sometime later. Of course, by the time Lord Hoster tied the Tully fortunes to those of the Stark-Arryn Baratheon alliance, Aerys Targaryen would have taken unspeakable action against one of his lords paramount, which very much became the casus belli of the war that would follow, as we'll see shortly.
This is where we wonder if it's significant that 2 groups of 4 may have departed the inn, or whatever location Lyanna was seen to disappear from. Was Brandon Stark told about a group that appeared to be riding for King's Landing? Did he in fact pursue the wrong group? Could this explain why he clearly expected that Rhaegar had returned there with his sister when he eventually rode into the Red Keep shouting for Rhaegar to, quote, come out and die? If so, it's pretty clear he never got close enough to whoever he was pursuing to see their identities. And so we wonder, after serving as decoys, whether wittingly or not, that second group, whom we believe to be Connington, Lonmouth, Mooton, and Martell, perhaps separated on errands of their own.
Fans have long suggested that messages from Rhaegar being delivered by Raven or in person to Lord Rickard Stark and Lord Hoster Tully would go a long way towards explaining the reactions of those two men, as we'll see shortly. Messages failing to reach Lord Jon Arryn in the Vale, where Ned Stark and Lord Robert Baratheon were known to be, might also explain Robert's reaction in particular. If true, and we had to guess, we'd suggest that either Richard Lonmouth, as a close friend of Lyanna's betrothed, or Miles Mooton, a member of a Riverlands family, went secretly to Riverrun. Perhaps Lewin Martell returned to Dragonstone to inform Elia, and John Connington was meant to liaise with his liege lord Robert Baratheon, but failed to do so. At least one, if not all, of these suggestions could be confirmed in the text at some point in the future.
And if messages had been successfully delivered only to Lords Stark and Tully, whatever calming effect they might have initially had, by the time Ned, Robert, and Lord Arryn were in proximity with Hoster Tully, the war would be too far gone for anything like a simple explanation to matter. Brandon and Lord Rickard would be dead, and thousands more besides. Whatever Rhaegar's intentions had been on that day, early in the year 282, when he arrived at the crossroads, it's unlikely that things had gone as he would have hoped.
His words to Jaime Lannister in King's Landing many months later, as he set out to face an enemy he perhaps had never wanted to face or intended to provoke, may hint at this. When the battle's done, I mean to call a council. Changes will be made. I meant to do it long ago. But, well, it does no good to speak of roads not taken. There's a hint of resignation in those words, perhaps acknowledging that events had gone seriously sideways, paired with a heart-wrenching conviction that he would return, perhaps to heal the realm, which Barristan Selmy suggested in A Dance with Dragons was something that was within the prince's power, if only things had gone differently.
That things had gone sideways is probably a huge understatement on our part. While Rhaegar may have been seeking to avoid a war by rescuing Lord Rickard Stark's daughter from his father's paranoia and cruelty, his intervention, with all the irony inherent in great tragic literature, not to mention prophecies, instead led to exactly the outcome he may have sought to deflect. For when Brandon Stark foolishly charged into the Red Keep, demanding the return of his sister and calling for the Crown Prince to come out and die, events had clearly moved outside of Rhaegar's ability to control.
Jaime Lannister takes up the tale in A Clash of Kings. Brandon rode into the Red Keep with a few companions, shouting for Prince Rhaegar to come out and die. But Rhaegar wasn't there. Aerys sent his guards to arrest them all for plotting his son's murder. The others were Lord's sons too, it seems to me. Catelyn agrees and adds further information, identifying Brandon's companions as Ethan Glover, Geoffrey Mallister, Kyle Royce, and Elbert Arryn, Jon Arryn's nephew and heir. She says, Aerys accused them of treason and summoned their fathers to court to answer the charge, with the sons as hostages. When they came, he had them murdered without trial, fathers and sons both. Though she does add that for some inexplicable reason, Ethan Glover had survived, and more on that one later.
And so Brandon Stark and his companions were consigned to the Black Cells, waiting for their fathers to arrive and answer for their supposed treason. Elbert Arryn had no father, his father having died before he was born, and no doubt his uncle, Lord Jon Arryn, would have been called to answer for him. Since Lord Jon did not rush to King's Landing, we can probably safely assume that Elbert died alone, perhaps even because of his uncle's refusal.
Kyle Royce and Geoffrey Mallister are another matter. While we don't know how either young man fits into the family trees of House Royce of the Vale, of which there are two branches, or House Mallister of Seaguard, since Catelyn offered no specific exceptions other than Ethan Glover, we can probably safely assume that their two fathers arrived in King's Landing and were executed along with their sons.
In the main series, we meet members of both houses. Bronze Yohn Royce of Runestone, a particular friend of Ned Stark's, and Lord Nestor Royce of the Junior Branch, who plays a significant role in some of Sansa's Vale chapters. One or both of these men likely lost two family members to Aerys, while in the Riverlands we meet Lord Jason Mallister, whom we presume also lost family, possibly a brother and a father, to the King's Justice.
Catelyn asserts to Jaime that the fathers and sons were all murdered without trial, but Jaime, who was present in the Red Keep in his capacity as Kingsguard, tells her that there was at least one trial of a sort. It turns out that when Lord Rickard Stark arrived, he demanded a trial by combat. In a sane world, he would likely have faced one of the Kingsguard, perhaps Jaime himself, with the outcome left in the hands of the gods. Even in the Targaryen world, the most extreme sort of trial by combat we've seen is the Trial of Seven forced upon Sir Duncan the Tall by Prince Aerion Brightflame nearly 80 years previously.
But in King Aerys II, Targaryen arrogance had reached new heights and was joined by a delusional mind that exceeded even that of Aerion Brightflame, who famously died after drinking wildfire in the belief it would transform him into a dragon. When Lord Stark asked for a trial, he was answered by Aerys' idea of the King's Justice, not a headsman or a champion, but fire. Aerys had grown to enjoy watching his enemies burn, and in this case, much like a 17th century witchfinder tossing a bound suspect into deep water to discern their guilt or innocence, Aerys told Lord Stark that all he had to do was not burn.
In A Clash of Kings, Jaime Lannister shares details with Catelyn that she'd never before heard. When the fire was blazing, Brandon was brought in. His hands were chained behind his back, and around his neck was a wet leathern cord attached to a device the king had brought from Tyrosh. His legs were left free, though, and his long sword was set down just beyond his reach. The pyromancers roasted Lord Rickard slowly, banking and fanning that fire carefully to get a nice, even heat. His cloak caught first, and then his surcoat, and soon he wore nothing but metal and ashes. Next he would start to cook, Aerys promised, unless his son could free him. Brandon tried, but the more he struggled, the tighter the cord constricted around his throat. In the end, he strangled himself.
While Catelyn's horror at the tale is nearly tangible, so too is Jaime's fury. He continues telling how Lord Rickard's steel plate became so hot that it turned red, while the gold accents on his spurs and armor melted and dripped into the fire. Jaime, a still idealistic youth, mere months into his role as a Kingsguard, stood silently at the foot of the Iron Throne until it was over, at which point Sir Gerald Hightower took him aside for a quick word. "You swore a vow to guard the king, not to judge him." Jaime's biting sarcasm over that hypocrisy puts his anger on full display. That was the White Bull, loyal to the end, and a better man than me, all agree.
With the murders of the Lord Paramount and Warden of the North and his heir, along with the nobles who had accompanied them to the capital, including apparently all 200 of the men who had accompanied Lord Rickard, Aerys Targaryen's madness was now on full display. But the Mad King was only just getting started. In the aftermath of the Starks' deaths, Aerys sent word to the Eyrie, where Ned Stark, now the Lord of Winterfell, and Lord Robert Baratheon were known to be staying. Knowing that both young men had prodigious reasons to feel wronged by House Targaryen, Aerys ordered Lord Jon Arryn to execute them both and deliver their heads to King's Landing.
Jon Arryn's response would be defiance and revolt. This, according to the World Book, is the true start of Robert's rebellion, and it came when the foster father who loved his former wards chose honor over obedience to his king.
When the Mad King Aerys II Targaryen had demanded their heads, the Lord of the Eyrie had raised his moon and falcon banners in revolt, rather than give up those he had pledged to protect.
When King Aerys sent word to Lord John Arryn in the Vale, demanding the heads of Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, we aren't told whether Eldred Arryn had already been executed at that point. What makes the most sense to us, given Cat's claim to Jaime that Aerys had accused Brandon and all of his companions of treason and, quote, summoned their fathers to court to answer the charge, is that this letter was also a summons to Lord Arryn, commanding him to come to the capital to answer for his heir.
And there's an interesting subtlety here that's easy to miss when one is swept up in the events that led so swiftly to the powder keg that was Westerosi politics in 282 AC, exploding into a rebellion that encompassed most of the realm. And that detail is Aerys' demand for Robert Baratheon's head. It's fairly easy to see that by this time Aerys viewed the Starks as dangerous and wanted to see them all dead, and more on his reasoning shortly. But did that viewpoint truly only start when Brandon charged into the Red Keep shouting for Rhaegar to come out and die?
It's actually the inclusion of Robert Baratheon, his cousin Stefan's eldest son, in his demands for retribution that suggests not. Robert may have been closely associated with Jon Arryn due to his fostering, and perhaps Aerys even viewed him as dangerous because of his close blood connection with House Targaryen. But he wasn't directly connected with any of the young men Aerys had accused of treason, except, of course, in one important way. The obvious connection between Robert Baratheon and the matter at hand was his betrothal to Lyanna Stark.
Certainly Aerys may have feared that Robert would react to Lyanna's disappearance similarly to her brother Brandon, and that, as it happens, is exactly what he did. But if we take a step back and look at the sequence of events from another angle, we begin to wonder if perhaps the fate of all the Starks, and even Robert Baratheon, may have been decided in the Mad King's mind when he discovered that the Mystery Knight at the tourney of Harrenhal had been none other than Lord Rickard's daughter, Lyanna.
Whatever Aerys knew about his eldest son's actions at the time Brandon Stark arrived in King's Landing, if we're correct about the abduction of Lyanna actually being a rescue, it would be hard to deny that the Mad King had already set his mind upon executing at least one Stark for the events at Harrenhal, which in his paranoid delusions he viewed as somehow treasonous. And given what he did once he had a different Stark in his clutches, it's not difficult to imagine that his paranoia by this point had convinced him of a vast conspiracy against him led by House Stark, leading to a decision to destroy every last one of them, and Lyanna's betrothed as well.
The king's demand for the heads of Ned and Robert, paired with Jon Arryn's refusal to comply, truly marks the moment of no return, when a war of rebellion against the king was not only assured, but viewed by many as justified. It's unlikely that Lyanna's active role in the situation was widely known, perhaps not even by all her family members. But taken all together, the abduction of a Lord Paramount's daughter, followed by the murder of her brother and father and numerous of their companions, then the demand for the heads of the new Lord Paramount of the North and his friend, the Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, not to mention an implied threat against the Lord Paramount of the Vale, whose heir was held in the royal dungeon and later executed, was a sequence of events that is hard to imagine any Targaryen king weathering without the aid of at least one very large, fire-breathing familiar.
All of which is to say that Aerys Targaryen had the mindset of a dragon lord, a dangerously paranoid and violent dragon lord at that, but without a single dragon to back up his demands. And there, at the heart of it all, is the Knight of the Laughing Tree, whose appearance at the tourney of Harrenhal had somehow convinced the Mad King that his reign was about to be challenged by a coalition of the nobility that had arrived at the great castle of the Riverlands to take part in what would come to be known as the greatest tourney of them all.
Of course, the facts of the matter, as we discussed in the tourney episode, seem to point to Rhaegar being at the head of exactly the type of coalition that his father feared. And let's not forget that when Rhaegar won the tourney and crowned Lyanna as Queen of Love and Beauty, the Master of Laws, Lord Simon Staunton, had declared to Aerys that such an act, quote, could only have been meant to win the allegiance of Winterfell to Prince Rhaegar's cause. With such dangerous and inflammatory rhetoric being fed to him by the toadies on his council, imagine what Aerys' reaction would have been when someone whispered the truth of the Knight of the Laughing Tree's identity in his ear.
Yeah, learning that the knight who he had already declared was no friend of his was in fact a Stark could only have confirmed the Mad King's worst fears. And so, unbeknownst to the Crown Prince at Dragonstone, the fates of all the Starks and their allies may have been decided long before Rhaegar ever set out to rescue Lyanna at the crossroads, placing Lyanna's escapade at the tourney of Harrenhal at the start of a devastating sequence of events more fully than anyone could have imagined.
As events would play out, we can see why perhaps a cross-section of people involved in the build-up may have chosen to withdraw from Westerosi public life. From Howland Reed, whose honour Lyanna had contrived to protect at the tourney, to Benjen Stark, who chose to take the Black in the aftermath of the war which his encouragement of his sister's hijinks may have helped cause, to John Connington, whose failure to deliver Rhaegar's messages after the abduction may have been just one of the failures that haunted him during the long years in Essos that followed. And even to Richard Lonmouth, who may have been haunted by similar failures or choices he had made that in his mind led directly to the death of his friend and prince, and many more besides.
But in early 282, that was all in the future. When Aerys' summons arrived at the Eyrie, Jon Arryn, in the words of Lord Godric Burrell of Sisterton, sent him back defiance. As Catelyn would recall, 16 years later at Winterfell, when word of Jon Arryn's death arrived, when the mad King Aerys II Targaryen had demanded their heads, the Lord of the Eyrie had raised his moon and falcon banners in revolt, rather than give up those he had pledged to protect.
Of course, Jon Arryn was the lord of but one of Aerys' provinces. His former wards, whom he had pledged to protect, were now lords paramount in their own rights, and it would fall to them to leave the Vale and return to their homes to summon their own banners in return. The problem would come when Lord Grafton refused Lord Arryn's summons and chose to remain loyal to House Targaryen. Their seat at Gulltown was the major port of the Vale, and because of Lord Grafton's choice, was closed to the two young lords seeking to leave the Vale.
It was at this point that the fledgling alliance divided itself. Taking advantage of the relative proximity of the north coast of the Vale to the great northern port of White Harbor at the mouth of the White Knife, Ned set out to cross the mountains that lay north of the Eyrie and seek passage across the body of water known as the Bight to White Harbor, seat of one of his most powerful bannermen, Lord Wyman Manderley.
In A Dance with Dragons, Davos Seaworth finds himself at Sisterton on Sweet Sister, one of 3 islands known as the Sisters that lay off the north coast of the Vale, perhaps as much as halfway across the Bight. There Lord Burrell tells him Ned Stark had indeed crossed the mountains and arrived on the Fingers, the peninsular land formations that comprised the north part of the Vale, and there had found a fisherman who agreed to take him across the Bight. But, says Lord Burrell, a storm caught them on the water and the fisherman drowned. It was his daughter that got Ned safely to the Sisters before the small boat went down.
As an aside, Lord Burrell goes on to deliver the claim that it was the fisherman's daughter who was Jon Snow's mother. Here we see the author, in the 5th book of the series, returning to a mystery for which he had laid most of the clues in the 1st book, in an attempt to muddy the waters, and also show the unreliability of hearsay. The fisherman's daughter is nothing more than a red herring, and we can imagine George laughing at the tongue-in-cheek nature of the device he chose to use in that story.
While the woman no doubt existed and may have been richly rewarded by Lord Stark for her bravery, the timeline simply doesn't work. The rebellion would continue for more than a year after Ned's escape from the Vale, and Jon Snow, the child Lord Burrell claims was born to the fisherman's daughter, was born sometime around the end of the war.
When Ned arrived at Sisterton, he was brought before its lord exactly as Davos was in A Dance with Dragons. Lord Burrell was advised by his maester to turn the would-be rebel over to the king, or at least to send him his head, in order to gain favor. But Lord Godric, the son of the lord who met with Ned, tells Davos, "By then we knew that Jon Arryn had taken Gulltown." And we'll have more on the Battle of Gulltown shortly, but suffice it to say that the rebel victory was so impressive that, in spite of the maester's claim that Rhaegar would defeat the rebels, Lord Burrell showed enough doubt for Ned to feel emboldened to tell him, "In this world, only winter is certain. We may lose our heads, it's true, but what if we prevail?"
And on the strength of that statement, Ned was set free to travel on to White Harbour with the warning, "If you lose, you are never here." Once in White Harbour, Ned would have sent messages to all his bannermen and then hurried north to Winterfell to oversee the muster of his banners. And we'll get back to Winterfell shortly to cover the details of the muster as far as we know them. But for now, we'll turn our attention to Gulltown, where Robert Baratheon had taken the fight to the Graftons in order to win his own way free of the Vale.
When Jon Arryn called his banners, they were likely summoned to muster at the Gates of the Moon, the Arryn Castle at the foot of the Giant's Lance, where the Lords of the Vale would retire when winter made the Eyrie inhospitable. But not all of his liegemen complied, with some, notably House Grafton of Gulltown and House Corbray of Heart's Home to the north, choosing to stay loyal to House Targaryen. Since Robert Baratheon needed a ship to transport him home to Storm's End, and no doubt also because Jon Arryn did not want to leave enemies behind him in the Vale when he marched, the newly declared rebels would march first to secure Gulltown for House Arryn.
Gulltown was and is a wealthy port town, the largest settlement in the Vale, boasting a sheltered deep harbour, making it not only a major trading centre, but also the principal route in and out of the Vale during winter, or whenever the hill tribes made the land passage across the mountains of the Moon dangerous, which was often. As such, control of Gulltown and its harbour were very important to the Lord of the Eyrie.
The Arryn army would have approached Gulltown from the west, as it sat far out on a peninsula on the north side of the Bay of Crabs, its principal neighbours being the Royces of Runestone, who were with Jon Arryn from the start, likely due to the fact that Aerys had recently murdered Kyle Royce and his father. As we said, it's unclear how they relate to Lord Yohn Royce, the head of the house in the main saga, but given his age, they could have been his brother and nephew, or perhaps even his father and younger brother.
Arriving at the stout walls of the city, it was Robert Baratheon who led the assault on the walls, becoming famous as the first man to cross them during the battle, and eventually securing the town for the Arryns by slaying Lord Mark Grafton in single combat. In the meantime, the gates had been opened to the Arryn army, and a fierce battle was fought, in which Lyn Corbray, fighting for the Graftons, won his spurs. The Corbrays, young Lyn, along with his father and older brother Lionel, would soon be reconciled with their overlord and would go on to join him in battles to come.
With Gulltown secured, Robert was able to take ship to the Stormlands to call his own banners, though it would prove a dangerous journey due to the risk posed by the royal fleet in Blackwater Bay. Once home, he summoned his liegemen just as Jon Arryn had done in the Vale. Robert faced a similar problem to his foster father, as not all of his banners were willing to answer the call. Lord Owen Merryweather of Longtable in the Reach was Aerys's hand, one of the infamous Lickspittle lords who Jaime Lannister would later remember as the Horn of Plenty hand. And it was he who sent messages across the realm declaring Lords Arryn, Stark, and Baratheon to be rebels and traitors, with their heads forfeit to the crown. Consequently, Stormlords Fell of Fellwood, Cafarin of Fontaine, and Grandison of Grandview ignored Robert's summons and planned to combine forces to overcome their liege lord in the name of the king.
Apparently, the young Lord John Connington of Griffin's Roost, first friend of Rhaegar Targaryen, who may have been present in the Riverlands when Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark disappeared together, also declined his liege lord's summons, though he doesn't seem to have taken the field against him at this point. And as we've noted, it's not entirely clear on which side Robert's erstwhile drinking buddy and Rhaegar's former squire, Sir Richard Lonmouth, landed at this point, though we've speculated that at some point he may have chosen Robert, since he had apparently been in favour of regime change and may have initially viewed the choice as being either for or against the Mad King, to whom he was naturally already opposed.
Nonetheless, Robert was soon able to muster a large enough army to march forth to meet the enemy in the field, leaving his younger brother Stannis behind to hold Storm's End in his name. In the meantime, while Jon Arryn consolidated his strength in the Vale, Ned Stark was gathering the army of the North at Winterfell.
Ned doesn't seem to have had any of the difficulties faced by Jon Arryn and Robert Baratheon, with recalcitrant bannermen choosing to remain loyal to the crown. The North were always an entity unto themselves, and the Starks were enormously popular leaders in most eras. Plus, it was their lord and his heir who had been murdered by the Targaryen king, and a Stark woman who had been apparently abducted by his son. It would appear that nearly every house in the north sent men in answer to Eddard's summons, including a number of the hill tribes.
And so the three main parts of the rebel army were soon assembled, while the Mad King ranted in the Red Keep and his hand stayed in the council chamber writing stern letters. Of the Crown Prince there was no word. Thus, the first major engagements of the rebellion would take place in the Stormlands, as those lords who had been encouraged to defy Robert took to the field in an effort to contain him. Up next, we'll have a look at how they fared.
Lords Grandison, Cafarin, and Fell planned to join their strength at Summerhall and march on Storm's End, but Robert learned their plans from an informer and rode at once with all his knights and squires. As the plotters came up on Summerhall one by one, he defeated each of them in turn before they could join up with the others.
With Robert Baratheon back at Storm's End and raising his levies, three of his principal bannermen, encouraged by Lord Merryweather's messages from King's Landing, decided to join forces and bring the battle to their liege lord before he could take the field. None can say what their plan when they reached Storm's End would have been, since, as it happened, they never arrived there.
Yet, given the fact that Storm's End was considered to be nearly impregnable, it's unclear if they planned a siege or merely hoped that their hot-headed young lord would ride forth to meet them in the field. In either case, they planned to meet at Summerhall, to the west of Storm's End, to join their forces and march east together. It's not clear where Grandview and Thornton, the seats of Lord Grandison and Cafarin respectively, are located, but based on the location of Fellwood, seat of House Fell, in the southern reaches of the Kingswood, let's suppose that the unknown locales were either to the west or north of Summerhall, making the ruined Targaryen palace a central meeting place.
However, as luck would have it, an informer notified Robert of their intent, and the young Stormlord executed a maneuver he would become famous for, the forced march that allowed him to surprise his enemies where they did not expect to find him. And so, when Lords Grandison, Catharin, and Fell arrived at Summerhall, each in turn, they discovered not their allies waiting for them, but Robert Baratheon, with his hastily assembled levy of knights and squires.
And with the element of surprise on his side, and his opponents confronted in the field one at a time before they were given an opportunity to join forces, Robert famously won 3 battles in a single day, facing off against each lord in turn, capturing Lords Catharin and Grandison, and killing Lord Fell in single combat before capturing his son, an apparently noted warrior known as Silveraxe.
While we aren't aware of an exact historical analog for this strategy of Robert's in real life, a more general strategy of taking advantage of interior lines to cut an army off from reinforcements or preventing units from joining strength in order to gain a numerical superiority is a fairly common tactic utilized from classical times right up through a number of more modern engagements. Robert Baratheon seemed to know instinctively that he must defeat his enemies individually before they had time to achieve that numerical superiority over him or invest his home base in a siege.
And so, by using the martial leadership he's so often noted for, Robert succeeded and then returned to Storm's End with his brother Stannis noting, "My brother had a gift for inspiring loyalty, even in his foes. At Summerhall he won 3 battles in a single day, and brought Lords Grandison and Catharin back to Storm's End as prisoners. He hung their banners in the hall as trophies. Catharin's white fawns was spotted with blood, and Grandison's sleeping lion was torn near in two. Yet they would sit beneath those banners of a night, drinking and feasting with Robert. He even took them hunting. These men meant to deliver you to Ares to be burned, I told him after I saw them throwing axes in the yard. You should not be putting axes in their hands." Robert only laughed. I would have thrown Grandison and Catharin into a dungeon, but he turned them into friends.
According to Yandel in the World Book, at this time, fighting then spread across the 7 kingdoms like wildfire as lords and knights took sides, and it was into this affray that Robert eventually marched again as he made his way north to join forces with his allies from the north and the Vale. Once again, leaving his brother Stannis in charge of Storm's End, Robert first headed west with his growing army that now included his former foes of houses Fell, Catharin, and Grandison, and seemingly representing a now nearly united Stormlands.
We know he entered the Reach, but not his reasons for doing so. It could be theorized, especially with the benefit of hindsight, that he hoped to secure a base of operations that would deter the armies of the Reach from marching into his home territory. But it's equally possible that he had some other goal in mind and was simply prevented from realizing it. Perhaps he hoped to meet a fragment of the Reach's loyalist army on its own and employ a similar strategy to the one that had worked so well at Summerhall. In any case, Robert eventually arrived at Ashford, known to readers as the site of the tourney where Robert's great-grandfather had fought in the Trial of Seven that ended with the death of Prince Baelor Targaryen.
And there, as it happened, he found the vanguard of the army of the Reach under the command of Lord Randall Tarley, waiting for him. Whatever Robert may have hoped, with the Reach being far greater in size than the Stormlands, even their vanguard was able to overrun the Stormlanders, with Lord Catharin slain by Lord Tarley in the fighting there. Unable to prevail, and with the greater numbers of Mace Tyrell's main force on their way, Robert was forced to withdraw and undertake another forced march, this one towards the north in the direction of the Riverlands.
Unsurprisingly, the World Book, apparently written by a maester currying favour with Robert, makes little mention of Ashford. We know of it mainly through a handful of references in the Storm of Swords, from Tyrion Lannister, who considered it an indecisive victory for the Reach; Stannis Baratheon, who offers that Lord Catharin died there fighting for his brother; and Maester Pylos at Dragonstone, who informs Edric Storm that King Robert was bested by Randall Tarley there. Later, in A Dance with Dragons, Stannis adds the detail that Mace Tyrell has been pleased to claim the honours for that victory, but Lord Randall had decided matters before Tyrell ever found the battlefield.
The only mention the World Book makes of Ashford is in referring to it as a partial victory for the Reach, mainly significant in that it left the Stormlands open to the Reach Lords after Robert's withdrawal north. Yandel notes how Mace Tyrell led his army nearly unopposed to the walls of Storm's End and encamped there, beginning a siege that would be made complete by Paxter Redwine's arrival with a blockading fleet in Stormbreaker Bay not long afterwards.
Of course, given the eventual outcome, the background of the investment of Storm's End is in reality only setting up another legendary event in the history of House Baratheon. But for now, we must leave Mace Tyrell feeling important in his stationary location and turn our eyes to the capital, where King Aerys was not at all pleased with the way things were going.
Lord Owen Merryweather had replaced Tywin Lannister as Hand following the latter's withdrawal after Aerys chose to name his heir Jaime to the Kingsguard. Jaime recalls Lord Owen as an old-done man, amiable but ineffectual, and thinks how replacing his father with Merryweather was akin to replacing a destrier with a donkey. His uncle Kevin takes it a step further by recalling how it was Merryweather's inaction that had allowed the rebellion to progress as far as it had up to the battle at Ashford.
It was perhaps inevitable that Merryweather would be replaced, but interestingly, it seems that Aerys' first choice for a replacement was his son and heir, Prince Rhaegar. The World Book tells us that at this point, Rhaegar could not be found, and so Aerys had, quote, turned to the next best thing, one of his son's closest friends. And so Lord Merryweather was exiled, with his lands seized by the crown and replaced by Lord John Connington of Griffin's Roost, a young man who had only recently inherited his father's vast tracts of lands on Cape Wrath, and a prominent member of the party of young men who had surrounded Rhaegar in the years previously when the atmosphere at court had seemed divided between the king's party and the prince's party.
In the first Arianne Wins a Winter sample chapter, the Dornish princess asks her friend Sir Daemon Sand, who was once Prince Oberyn Martell's squire, what he knows about John Connington. There's small insight there, but it's a good place for us to start when analyzing what would turn out to be John Connington's brief tenure as Hand and the battle that would prove his undoing.
Sand starts with the basics, telling her Connington was Lord of Griffin's Roost when Griffin's Roost was still a lordship worth having, Prince Rhaegar's squire, or one of them, later Prince Rhaegar's friend and companion. The Mad King named him Hand during Robert's rebellion. When Arianne comments this is all well known, he adds the small amount of personal insight he has, telling her that Connington was, quote, proud for a certainty, even arrogant, a faithful friend to Rhaegar, but prickly with others. Robert was his liege, but I've heard it said that Connington chafed at serving such a lord. Even then, Robert was known to be fond of wine and whores.
So, interesting that it seems that this is one Stormlord at least who was not troubled by choosing the ruling dynasty over his liege. Then, in A Dance with Dragons, Kevin Lannister offers a little more insight, including his brother Tywin's opinion of the young Hand. A proud youth, the most headstrong of the gaggle of young lordlings who had gathered around Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, competing for his royal favor. Arrogant, but able and energetic. That, and his skill at arms, was why Mad King Aerys had named him Hand. Old Lord Merryweather's inaction had allowed the rebellion to take root and spread, and Aerys wanted someone young and vigorous to match Robert's own youth and vigor. Too soon, Lord Tywin Lannister had declared when word of the king's choice had reached Casterly Rock. Connington is too young, too bold, too eager for glory.
And indeed, in that very same A Dance with Dragons chapter, Grand Maester Pycelle recalls how, after he was raised to hand, John Connington had stood in the throne room and, quote, told King Aerys how he would deliver him the head of Robert Baratheon. Such a declaration likely felt thrilling for the young lord, but he would have been wise to recall that Aerys was not a particularly forgiving monarch, and perhaps been more guarded in his predictions of victory.
While Ares was busy replacing his old, cautious hand with a young, bold, and overconfident one, Robert and his Stormlords continued their march north. The goal, of course, was to join up with Ned Stark and Jon Arryn. According to the World Book, there were more victories for Robert as he made his way to the Riverlands, which seems to have been the natural place for the allies to come together.
It's commonly assumed that Robert was wounded at Ashford, which is certainly possible. But the fact that Robert taking a wound at Ashford is never explicitly mentioned, paired with the mention in the World Book of other victories as they marched to the Riverlands, introduces the intriguing possibility that his wound, if it existed, was taken after Ashford. But where the World Book, with its definitive Baratheon bias, mentions other victories along the march, the World of Ice and Fire app speaks of a grueling march, Lord Connington's army giving chase and harrying the Stormlanders, and the wounded Robert ultimately being forced to take refuge at Stony Sept.
Whatever the case, references to Robert being wounded and alone in the town of Stony Sept before that battle seem to imply two things. First, that his army apparently left him there to be, quote, tended by some friends, while they traveled on to a predetermined meeting place to join Lords Stark and Arryn. And second, the fact that John Connington apparently knew where Robert could be found not only suggests a traitor in the town, but also that Robert may have been there for some time, recuperating.
Unless, of course, the intelligence received by John Connington about Robert's condition was false, and Robert's solitary occupation of the town was always meant to bait the hot-headed new hand. We have no real way of proving this idea yet, but there are people who might shed light on it in the future story through memories or visions, Sir Richard Lonmouth, should he reappear, being one of them, and of course green-seeing Bran Stark being another. However, we can offer a pair of observations in support of the idea that just maybe Robert wasn't as wounded as was claimed, and instead was having the time of his life while he hid in the town and waited for the trap to spring.
Well, first let's take the girl Bella, who Arya meets at a brothel called the Peach when she visits Stony Sept with the Brotherhood Without Banners in A Storm of Swords. Bella claims she's a king's daughter, and when Arya expresses her skepticism, Bella says, well, I might be. They say King Robert had my mother when he hid here, back before the battle. Not that he didn't have all the other girls too, but Leslin says he liked my ma the best. So, far from being grievously wounded, it appears that Robert was taking advantage of the local offerings in the days before the battle, apparently all of them.
And secondly, let's take Robert's prowess in the battle when it eventually reached him. As we'll see, he apparently killed 6 men in single combat and came quite close to killing the Hand as well. If Robert had been wounded so badly that his army had to leave him behind, surely he might not have been quite so daunting in the battle when it came.
John Connington recalls what happened once he reached the town with the royal army. The townsfolk were hiding him. They moved him from one secret bolt hole to the next, always one step ahead of the king's men. The whole town was a nest of traitors. At the end, they had the usurper hidden in a brothel. What sort of king was that who would hide behind the skirts of women? Yet whilst the search dragged on, Eddard Stark and Hoster Tully came down upon the town with a rebel army. Bells and battle followed, and Robert emerged from his brothel with a blade in hand and almost slew Jon on the steps of the old sept that gave the town its name.
That's a first-hand memory that proves an error in the story Harwin tells Arya in A Storm of Swords. He slew 6 men that day, they say. He would have slain the Hand too, but the battle never brought them together. It also reveals that once the rebel army was outside the town and the bells started ringing, Robert emerged from his hiding spot, and we'll get back to what that might imply shortly. Now, before we run through the details of the battle, let's catch up with Ned Stark and Jon Arryn.
Well, we last saw Ned at Winterfell, summoning his banners for the march south. By the time Ned reached his home from the Vale, the North had already lost more than 200 men to Aerys, and so there would be no loyalists to distract his efforts, such as both Jon Arryn and Robert, and even ultimately Hoster Tully had to contend with. The Northmen were loyal to the Starks, full stop, and they answered his summons.
If we assume that the strength of the North didn't change much in the 15 or so years after the start of Robert's rebellion, then we can conclude that Ned may have assembled a force of nearly 20,000 men before he marched south to rendezvous with Jon Arryn. Among them were Lord Rickard Karstark, the recently wed Lord Willem Dustin, Sir Mark Riswell, Lord Roose Bolton, Lord Wyman Manderley, Mors Umber and his sons, Theowall, known as Buckets, Martin Cassell, father to Jory, and even the young Cranagman Howland Reed.
Jon Arryn left the Vale accompanied by his loyal bannermen, which now included the Corbrays who had fought against him on the walls of Gulltown, and his new heir, his cousin Dennis Arryn, the so-called Darling of the Vale. And given that his rendezvous with the Northmen and the Stormlanders was evidently planned to take place in the Riverlands, this would be a good time to address Lord Hoster Tully's support of the rebel cause.
We last saw Lord Hoster at Riverrun, railing at Brandon Stark's rash behaviour. Obviously, with the Stark heir set to marry his eldest daughter in a matter of days, the subsequent murders of both Brandon and his father by King Aerys were a considerable offence to House Tully, following on the less impactful but likely also offensive situation of Aerys naming Jaime Lannister to his Kingsguard mere weeks before his betrothal to Lysa Tully was to be announced. And then, in A Game of Thrones, Catelyn tells Sir Roderick Cassell that she knew that Ned would marry me in his brother's place, not long after Brandon's death, when she burned the letter Peter Baelish sent her, unread.
Easy to see, then, that House Tully had a considerable stake in the success of the rebellion essentially from its beginnings, and so, not for the first time in Westeros' history, the centrally located rolling plains of the Riverlands would become the epicenter of the fighting. But the Riverlands were not as united as the North or even as the Vale and Stormlands turned out to be after some initial consternation. Again, in A Game of Thrones, Catelyn thinks about how the Darrys, Rygers, and Mootons had all stayed loyal to the Targaryens, while House Frey's late arrival on the scene of the final battle left unanswered questions about which side they had intended to support, and more on that later.
It seems most likely that the armies of the North, Vale and Riverlands met at the crossroads in the area of the Trident, and then rushed overland to Stony Sept to join with the Stormlanders. We can be almost certain that Ned's army didn't cross the Green Fork any sooner than the ford at the Trident, since Lord Walder Frey and his crossing are never mentioned, and as we said, didn't ultimately choose a side until the final battle was won. It's certainly possible that the Northmen and Valemen rendezvoused at the crossroads where the King's Road meets the High Road, and then headed west into the central Riverlands to meet Hoster Tully. We can only say with certainty that they were together when the rebel army descended on Stony Sept.
As for the army of the Stormlands, that's more difficult to say. According to the World of Ice and Fire app, John Connington's army had harried Robert on his journey from Ashford to Stony Sept. However, given the fact that Stony Sept is due north overland from Ashford, we find it very unlikely that there was the constant nipping at heels that the app suggests. Connington's army would have mustered near the capital, and as such, wouldn't have had a clear line to intersect Robert until the young Stormlord had crossed the Gold Road and entered the Riverlands, unless Robert had taken main roads instead of going overland, which seems even more unlikely with what we know of the man and the situation.
And so we suggest that at a certain point, Robert may have intentionally allowed himself to be seen by the Loyalists, if only to lead them on a merry chase right into the heart of the Riverlands. Probably one of the strongest factors supporting this idea is that once they reach the Riverlands, Robert's army seems to disappear. By the time Robert is known to be hiding in the town of Stony Sept, John Connington thinks of him as wounded and alone, and brings his entire force into the town and begins a search. It says, "And so he swept down on Stony Sept, closed off the town, and began a search. His knights went house to house, smashed in every door, peered into every cellar. He had even sent men crawling through the sewers, yet somehow Robert still eluded him."
Harwin of Winterfell tells a similar tale to Arya in A Storm of Swords, along with what happened next. The Mad King's men had been hunting Robert, trying to catch him before he could rejoin your father. He was wounded, being tended by some friends, when Lord Connington the Hand took the town with a mighty force and started searching house by house. Before they could find him, though, Lord Eddard and your grandfather came down on the town and stormed the walls.
There is not a single mention of Robert's army being with him inside the town when Connington arrived, and in fact both Connington and Harwin seem to think he was very much alone. And so we suggest that Robert was the very juicy bait in a devious trap, and that he had intentionally let it be known that his army had left him inside Stony Sept, while sending that army racing ahead to find their allies coming from points north, west, and east, in order to lead them back to take the arrogant young hand by surprise.
And John Connington's first-hand memories support this. He recalls with frustrating clarity how Robert was moved from house to house by the townsfolk, and how his desperate search had yielded him nothing. The futility of it even haunts his dreams. 17 years later, in his first viewpoint chapter in A Dance with Dragons, John thinks, "Last night he dreamt of Stony Sept again. Alone with sword in hand, he ran from house to house, smashing down doors, racing upstairs, leaping from roof to roof as his ears rang to the sound of distant bells. Deep bronze booms and silver chiming pounded through his skull, a maddening cacophony of noise that grew ever louder until it seemed as if his head would explode."
And speaking of bells, let's return once more to Harwin's second-hand description of the events to Arya in A Storm of Swords. After mentioning that Ned and Lord Hoster came down on the town before Connington's army could find Robert, he tells her how the Septons began to ring their bells to warn the townsfolk of the impending battle, adding, "Robert came out of hiding to join the fight when the bells began to ring." Considering that, according to both John's and Harwin's accounts, by the time Ned arrived, the royal army had already been inside the town for some time, conducting its house-to-house search, taking hostages, offering both rewards and threats for Robert's location, we have to assume that the townsfolk were already well aware of the violence and needed no special signal to stay inside behind locked doors. The one person in the town who likely did need a signal that the rebel army had arrived outside the walls was its commander, who happened to be hiding inside a brothel when the bells began to ring, possibly the very one Arya stays at in A Storm of Swords, known as the Peach.
Harwin goes on to relate that Robert slew 6 men that day, including Rhaegar's close friend Miles Mooton. Both Harwin and the World Book suggest that the battle never brought the Hand and the rebel lord together, but John Connington recalls differently. In his viewpoint, it says, Robert emerged from his brothel with blade in hand and almost slew Jon on the steps of the old sept that gave the town its name.
So Robert's ferocious performance in the battle, once the bells began to ring, might give the lie to his injury, but Connington's memories also imply a failure on the young Stormlord's part that was no less than his own. Though Jon is haunted by his own failure to kill Robert, so must Robert have been angered by his own failure to kill the hand and commander of the royal army when he had the opportunity. Perhaps that's the reason that the widely known history of the battle, as related by Harwinter Aya and by Maester Yandel in the Baratheon Positive World Book, suggest that Robert and Jon never came face to face.
Yeah, a scenario in which Robert killed the hand of the king and definitively defeated the royal army might have led to a much speedier conclusion to the rebellion by leaving King's Landing open to his army that now represented 4 of the realm's 9 regions, with 3 supporting the crown and only the Westerlands and Iron Islands remaining uncommitted. And more on both of those later. As it was, Connington managed to wound Hoster Tully and kill Jon Arryn's new heir, Sir Dennis Arryn, before seeing that the day was lost and calling a retreat.
Harwin implies that Connington did not oversee an orderly withdrawal when he says the hand flew off as fast as the griffins on his shield, which is supported by Jaime's narrative that after the battle, quote, Jon Darry and Barristan Selmy rode to Stony Sept to rally what they could of the Griffin's men. It certainly goes without saying that the failure, especially in light of the boastful promise he had made to Aerys prior to the battle, led to Connington's immediate exile.
As for the rebels, they had gained much and lost little. Jaime tells Brienne that after Stony Sept, Aerys had, quote, finally realized that Robert was no mere outlaw lord to be crushed at whim, but the greatest threat House Targaryen had faced since Daemon Blackfyre. The most significant loss they suffered was the death of Sir Dennis Arryn, Lord Arryn's heir since the death of his nephew Elber in Aerys' custody. But that loss would present the rebel leaders with an opportunity to tie the Riverlands even closer to their cause.
In A Storm of Swords, with the father dying and making disjointed references to Tansy and blood and other trueborn babes, Catelyn pieces together a version of what had happened during those early days of the rebellion, not quite getting to the truth, but close enough as far as it concerned Jon Arryn. She realized that her sister must have had an out-of-wedlock pregnancy and a miscarriage before she was betrothed to the childless Jon Arryn, who found himself in need of an heir. Lysa was the price Jon Arryn had to pay for the swords and spears of House Tully.
While missing out on some pertinent details, Kat's conclusion is close enough to the truth for our purposes here. Jon Arryn married Lysa Tully in a double ceremony with Ned Stark and Catelyn in the Sept at Riverrun, not long after the Battle of Stony Sept. The World Book gets these details a bit fuzzy when it suggests that the Riverlands' entry into the conflict only came after the marriages. Lord Hoster was without a doubt at Stony Sept, since he's noted to have been wounded in the battle, and it's clear from Kat's memories that the actual weddings came later, after the death of Sir Dennis Arryn. But the gist remains that following Stony Sept, the Riverlands, North, Vale, and Stormlands were closely, if not universally, united against the Targaryens.
Up next, we'll take a look at where all the major players are, including some we haven't heard from in quite a while, as we move towards the climactic battle of the rebellion. But first, it's time to thank our patrons from the Valyrian Steel and Dragonglass levels.
Thanks to our Valyrian Steel patrons, Aileen, Arshia, Oxheart, Amber the Adamant, Blythe Spirit, Archmaester Kobe of the Higher Mysteries, Cabot the Unfrozen, Dean, Dolorous Fred, Lord Sosa and his faithful canine companion Theoden, Jill, JM, Herbert Westeros, the Miskatonic Maester, Lady Silverwing, Mark, the Sathorian, W, Sword of the Evening, and Lady Direliz of Castleknocky, the Alpha Patron, as well as our Dragonglass patrons Ange, Fairy Glen, Lady Faith, Maiden of the Tree, Lynn, and Leonardo Corleone.
John, Darry, and Barristan Selmy rode to Stony Sept to rally what they could of Griffin's men, and Prince Rhaegar returned from the south.
In the aftermath of Stony Sept, John Connington was exiled in disgrace. As with his predecessor, Lord Merryweather, Connington was, quote, stripped of honours, lands, and wealth, and packed off across the sea to die in exile. For the third act of the revolt, Aerys would turn to Lord Carleton Chelstead, formerly his Master of Coin, whom Jaime Lannister thinks of as the mace and dagger hand after his house's sigil. To Lord Chelstead was given the difficult task of containing a rebellion that had already engulfed nearly half the realm, and it was under his watch that John Darry and Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard were sent into the Riverlands to recover what they could of the royalist forces.
Another two of Aerys' Kingsguard would also be sent into the field in hopes of gathering support. Jaime recalls that the king had reminded Lewin Martell gracelessly that he held Elia and sent him to take command of the 10,000 Dornishmen coming up the King's Road. Meanwhile, Lord Commander Gerald Hightower was sent to recall Prince Rhaegar to the capital. This is a rather curious detail given that just a few short weeks or months earlier, Aerys had chosen John Connington as hand because Rhaegar, quote, could not be found.
And so we wonder if Hightower was left to comb the entire realm in search of the missing prince, or if perhaps, as seems much more likely, he had received some information as to where the man could be found. And as the source of this information, we suggest one of two possibilities.
First would be John Connington himself. He was chosen as hand not only because of his youth and vigour, but also due to his close friendship with Rhaegar. Perhaps Aerys even thought choosing a member of the prince's party might bind other members of that group to his cause. As a close friend of the prince, who was also very likely to have been present when Rhaegar met Lyanna in the Riverlands, and more than likely privy to his reasons for doing so, we wonder if perhaps he had been entrusted with their destination and then passed that information on to Lord Commander Hightower after the disaster at Stony Sept.
The other alternative is a bit more complex. Fans have long wondered about the role Lady Ashara Dane might have played in the rebellion. Sister to Sir Arthur Dane of the Kingsguard, lady-in-waiting to Rhaegar's wife, Princess Elia Martell, and supposed love interest of young Ned Stark, she's come under scrutiny by fans largely due to something George told the fan who was wondering about the chronology of the rebellion way back in 1999, just prior to the release of A Storm of Swords. Ashara Dane was not nailed to the floor in Starfall, as some of the fans who write me seem to assume. They have horses in Dorne too, you know, and boats, though not many of their own. As a matter of fact, a tiny tidbit from Storm of Swords, she was one of Princess Elia's lady companions in King's Landing in the first few years after Elia married Rhaegar.
Of course, George is referring to now well-known details from the tale of the tourney at Harrenhal that were introduced in A Storm of Swords, and implying that Lady Ashara would likely have been with Princess Elia in King's Landing, while also making the tantalizing statement that Ashara was not nailed to the floor, and mentioning horses, ships, etc. And so a sort of mythology has arisen around the young lady in which it is she who travels around bearing covert messages to and from King's Landing, and it was from her that Hightower learned of the prince's location.
Of course, both options could be true, with Ashara perhaps being the source of the information and Connington passing it on to the Lord Commander. Other than George's statements about her potential for travel, all we can say with certainty about Ashara Dane is that she seems to have become pregnant at some point in 281 AC, and that the child would apparently be stillborn, and that she would be found at her home, Starfall, by the end of the rebellion in 283, after which she would apparently commit suicide by throwing herself from the top of a tower at Starfall known as the Palestone Sword, though no body was ever recovered.
And while we could probably go on at great length about Ashara Dane, and just might in a future episode, for now we want to focus on the possibility that it was she who relayed Rhaegar's location to Gerald Hightower and what he did with that knowledge. According to the World of Ice and Fire app, Ares sent Sir Gerald Hightower to recall Rhaegar to his duties. And Rhaegar obeyed his father's summons, but not before commanding the Lord Commander to remain in the south along with Sir Arthur Dane and Sir Oswell Went to guard Lyanna Stark.
The questions of where this occurred and why Lyanna Stark needed guarding and from whom are worth exploring. Much later in the timeline, it would be revealed, through Ned Stark's viewpoint in A Game of Thrones, that the location to which Rhaegar had brought his sister was an abandoned watchtower in the Red Mountains along the Prince's Pass, and that Rhaegar himself had named the place the Tower of Joy.
Rhaegar's choice of name for the place where he had hidden Lyanna Stark is in itself a potent hint that this was no evil kidnapping plot as Robert Baratheon seems to have believed. Further, if this was a simple kidnapping, surely his prize would have been safer in the Red Keep, behind strong stone walls, rather than in a crumbling watchtower. And then there's the matter of her guards. At a time of extreme danger to the royal family, Rhaegar chose to command 3 of the 7 members of the Royal Kingsguard to remain in the Red Mountains to guard a young woman he had supposedly taken from friends and family against her will. In the context of what we'll call the Baratheon narrative, it just doesn't make sense.
However, if we remove that narrative and examine the bare facts of the matter as we know them, we can begin to piece together a possible scenario that does make sense, albeit one with plenty of information still missing or hidden. We've already suggested that Rhaegar met Lyanna at the tourney of Harrenhal before honoring her as the Queen of Love and Beauty there in recognition of her role as the Knight of the Laughing Tree, and later rescuing her from being seized by his father, who suspected the Mystery Knight of being a traitor. It's also been suggested that Rhaegar was aware of an end-of-days prophecy known as the Song of Ice and Fire that he had deduced involved House Stark and House Targaryen, combined with the fact that the Kingsguard are bound by oath to protect members of the royal family. These details point inexorably toward the conclusion of a marriage and a pregnancy, bringing Lyanna Stark and her unborn child into the circle of royal family that the White Knights were bound to protect.
As we said, many details remain unknown or more likely intentionally obscured by the author, but the 3 Kingsguard remaining with Lyanna at the Tower of Joy while their king and prince faced an existential threat from her own friends and family is an incontrovertible fact. And so we leave them there for now and follow Rhaegar back to King's Landing.
Regarding Rhaegar's return, the World Book merely states, Prince Rhaegar returned from the south, as if he had been away on a diplomatic mission or a vacation, rather than hiding away for months with the daughter of the Lord Paramount whose subsequent death had been one of the causes of the current hostilities. And with Rhaegar's return, command of the army, composed of new levies being raised from the Crown lands, passed to him rather than the new hand, Lord Chelstead.
The World Book adds that the 10,000 Dornish spears which Prince Lewin Martell had been sent to take command of would soon bolster Rhaegar's army, while also mentioning that those spears had come in defense of Princess Elia. Nowhere is any rancor between Rhaegar and either Elia or Lewin Martell mentioned, not even in the viewpoint of Jaime Lannister, from whom much of our unofficial information about this time comes.
Jaime was the sole Kingsguard who had not been sent out into the field, while the World Book noted that those who were there at court during this time have recounted that Aerys' behavior was erratic, and that the king trusted only in his white cloaks, it also specifies that he kept Jaime close at all hours to serve as hostage against his father. It's therefore Jaime, ever present as witness at the king's side, who adds the detail that after Rhaegar returned, he, quote, persuaded his father to swallow his pride and summon my father. But no raven returned from Casterly Rock, and that made the king even more afraid.
So we can infer that Lord Tywin was watching to see which way the wind would blow before committing the army of the Westerlands to the conflict. It has been suggested that as far back as the Defiance of Duskendale, Tywin had seen that Rhaegar would be a far better ruler than his father, and had hedged his bets even then. Even now, if the royalists should prevail, his daughter Cersei remained unwed, and if the delicate Princess Elia of Dorne should die, why, what better match for the bereaved Prince of Dragonstone than the daughter of the man who had helped to save his family's throne?
Why then did Tywin hesitate? Surely the army of the West could have made a crucial difference, perhaps even the difference, in the battles to come, a fact of which he would be well aware. Given the eventual outcome, and the fact that Tywin would appear in the Crownlands with his very large and unblooded army at a critical moment, we suggest that Tywin didn't hesitate to act, only avoided sending a reply. He gathered his army and marched east, just waiting for news to show him which side he should commit to.
In the meantime, Aerys was spiraling ever further into paranoia. Jaime adds this about Aerys' mindset after Tywin didn't reply to his summons. He saw traitors everywhere, and Varys was always there to point out any he might have missed. And it was at this point that the Mad King began to turn once more to the alchemists who had helped him murder Rickard Stark. Once again, it's Jaime Lannister, the lone Kingsguard at court in those days, who has the details. His Grace commanded his alchemists to place caches of wildfire all over King's Landing, beneath Baelor's Sept, and in the hovels of Fleabottom, under stables and storehouses at all 7 gates, even in the cellars of the Red Keep itself.
Because Rhaegar was busy marshalling the royal army and the other members of the Kingsguard were absent, it seems that 16-year-old Jaime Lannister was the only person fully aware of the wildfire plot other than its architects, though as we'll see, Lord Carlton Chelstead would soon grow suspicious about the activities of the pyromancers.
In the meantime, John Darrion Barristan Selmy had returned with the remnants of John Connington's army, and soon, with the addition of the Dornish spears under the command of Louis Martell, the royal levy would number nearly 40,000 men. In the south, Lord Mace Tyrell had kept the army of the Reach encamped outside of Storm's End, surrounding the castle from the landward side, while his liegeman, Lord Paxter Redwine of the Arbour, had sealed Shipbreaker Bay with a naval blockade. Robert Baratheon's home was unreachable to him by land or sea, and those within were prevented from receiving supplies or relief of any kind.
And so we move on to the next act, which will be the climactic one. With armies massing all over the realm, it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. Up next, for the 3rd time in just over a year, Rhaegar Targaryen departs King's Landing, heading for an appointment with fate in the Riverlands.
When this battle's done, I mean to call a council. Changes will be made. I meant to do it long ago, but, well, it does no good to speak of roads not taken. We shall talk when I return. Those were the last words Rhaegar Targaryen ever spoke to him. Outside the gates an army had assembled, whilst another descended on the trident. So the Prince of Dragonstone mounted up and donned his tall black helm and rode forth to his doom.
When Rhaegar Targaryen returned to King's Landing, no doubt many people in both the King's party and the Prince's party breathed a sigh of relief. One of those would have been Jaime Lannister, who clearly idolized the older man and chafed at the position he was kept in at the King's insistence, standing silently at the foot of the Iron Throne while his fellow Kingsguard were given roles of leadership and importance.
We don't ever get to hear what, if anything, Jaime thought of the missing 3 Kingsguard, though we certainly might one day. We wonder if Rhaegar offered an explanation, or if their mission remained shrouded in secrecy. What we do get from Jaime is a window into the king's actions and state of mind, as well as the distinct impression that Rhaegar, along with nearly everyone else, was oblivious to his father's sinister plans.
Jaime thinks that, quote, the Queen's eyes had been closed for years and Rhaegar was busy marshalling an army. But he also adds, Aerys's new mace and dagger hand was not utterly stupid, and with Rossart, Baelys, and Garrigus coming and going night and day, he became suspicious. The mace and dagger hand is, of course, Lord Carlton Chelstead, and while Jaime's thoughts might imply Chelstead's suspicions began before the prince's departure, given what came next, we think it's pretty clear that he took action only after Rhaegar had left the capital, and so hold that thought for a moment while we turn back to Jaime and the Dragon Prince.
Many of Jaime's memories come to us in typical disjointed fashion, some from his inner thoughts in his early viewpoint chapters, others from his feverish bathhouse scene with Brienne of Tarth in A Storm of Swords, and still others from a dream he has in the Riverlands in the same volume, or from his thoughts in A Feast for Crows after he's returned to King's Landing to find things much changed. We learn that Rhaegar had explicitly entrusted his family to Jaime's care, though the wisdom of leaving a single inexperienced young man to guard 6 members of the royal household is left for us to judge.
It must be said that Rhaegar surely didn't anticipate King's Landing falling, nor his father's plans for the city, and especially not his own fate, given the conversation he had with Jaime on the day he left for the Riverlands. Jaime's memories give us a snapshot of that day, along with a window into his own state of mind. It says, the day had been windy when he said farewell to Rhaegar in the yard of the Red Keep. The prince had donned his night-black armor with the 3-headed dragon picked out in rubies on his breastplate. Your Grace, Jaime had pleaded, let Darry stay to guard the king this once, or Sir Barristan. Their cloaks are as white as mine.
So we see a young man desperate for glory, begging to be allowed to participate in the battle to come. Rhaegar's reply is the single biggest indicator of both his intentions and his expectations as he went to meet his cousin on the battlefield. Rhaegar had put his hand on Jaime's shoulder. When this battle's done, I mean to call a council. Changes will be made. I meant to do it long ago, but, well, it does no good to speak of roads not taken. We shall talk when I return.
But he also commented on his father's state of mind when he told the young Kingsguard, my royal sire fears your father more than he does our cousin Robert. He wants you close, so Lord Tywin cannot harm him. I dare not take that crutch away from him at such an hour. This comment clearly upset Jaime, who didn't like being reduced to a crutch, but in the bathhouse scene we also see that adult Jaime fully understood the nuance of the reasoning when he tells Brienne, Aerys liked to keep me close. I was my father's son, so he did not trust me. He wanted me where Varys could watch me, day and night.
One thing Rhaegar doesn't acknowledge in the limited viewpoint we have of him is that if Aerys was holding Jaime Lannister close as hostage for his father's continued loyalty, or at least inaction, he was doing exactly the same with Rhaegar's wife and children and the army of Dorne. Perhaps, though, the prince was fully aware and explicitly tasked Jaime with guarding them for that reason. Or perhaps he, like Jaime, never thought they could come to any harm in the Red Keep.
Varys is rarely mentioned in the context of the rebellion, but certainly plays a role in this chapter. Jaime thinks about the spider watching him day and night, implying that the king not only wanted a hostage, but feared some clandestine activity by his last remaining Kingsguard that could lead to the powerful Lord Tywin entering the conflict on Robert's side. Not an unreasonable fear given the state of the relationship between the one-time friends. But what Varys himself was planning during those days and weeks as Jaime stood at Aerys' side, guarding him and keeping his secrets, remains cloaked in secrecy, and more on that shortly.
One thing we can address now is whether or not Varys knew about what Aerys was planning. Regarding the wildfire plot, Jaime thinks that everything was done in the utmost secrecy by a handful of master pyromancers. They did not even trust their own acolytes to help. He goes on to think about Rhaella and Rhaegar being oblivious for reasons of their own. But in the same passage, he mentions that Varys was always there, and so it seems incredible to us that Varys could have missed something as significant as the king plotting with the Alchemist Guild to blow up the city as a last resort.
So, let us assume that Varys knew and kept silent for reasons of his own. But as we mentioned, another person who was not explicitly in the circle of knowledge, but who soon became suspicious of the pyromancer's activity, was the new hand, Lord Carlton Chelstead. Once again, Jaime recalls what happened. I'd thought the man craven, but the day Chelstead confronted Aerys, he found some courage somewhere. He did all he could to dissuade him. He reasoned, he jested, he threatened, and finally he begged. When that failed, he took off his chain of office and flung it down on the floor.
Perhaps Lord Chelstead had looked at the fates of his two predecessors, Lords Merryweather and Connington, and reasoned that exile was worth the risk to save the capital from what Aerys was planning. If so, he reckoned without Aerys' increasing fascination with the flames. Ever since the defiance of Duskendale, the king had turned to the alchemists, first in an effort to hatch dragon eggs, and later as a means of executing his perceived enemies. In the latter part of Aerys' reign, fire became more than a part of his house words. It became his champion, his executioner.
And so Lord Carlton Chelstead was given to the flames and then replaced by the head of the Pyromancers Guild, the man known as Lord Rosart, though as with Varys the Spider, it's highly likely the title Lord was merely an honorific that came with no lands and no power. But as Hand, Rosart had all the power he desired. Jaime recalls how, quote, Rosart's eyes would shine when he unrolled his maps to show where the substance must be placed, adding that his chief assistants, Garrigus and Baelus, were the same.
We want to address something regarding the timeline that often throws the sequence of events in King's Landing during this time into question. In A Storm of Swords, Jaime distinctly remembers being the only Kingsguard left in the city after Rhaegar took the army north and Aerys' wildfire plot escalated. He even singles out Jon Darry as one of his white brothers who accompanied the prince. Since we know, and minor spoilers here, that Darry never returned to the capital, Jaime's memory of the day of Lord Chelstead's death can lead to some head-scratching. Here's the passage. Whenever Aerys gave a man to the flames, Queen Rhaella would have a visitor in the night. The day he burned his mace and dagger hand, Jaime and Jon Darry had stood at guard outside her bedchamber whilst the king took his pleasure. "You're hurting me," they heard Rhaella cry through the oaken door. "You're hurting me." In some queer way, that had been worse than Lord Chelstead's screaming. "We are sworn to protect her as well," Jaime had finally been driven to say. "We are," Darry allowed, "but not from him."
And we think this is a classic example of the unreliable narrator. Did Jaime and Jon Darry stand guard together outside Rhaella's chamber while her husband assaulted her? Of that, we can have no doubt. But we also know that Chelstead wasn't the only man Aerys burned, and can point to Lord Rickard Stark as another prime example of an execution by fire for which Jaime was present. We also have both Jaime's and Tyrion's words that Chelstead's successor was only hanged for a fortnight, which implies that Chelstead died well after Rhaegar's departure, in fact, probably closer to the defeat at the Trident.
Yeah, for all these reasons, we think that Jaime's memory has fused several different events into one. Given Rhaella's state when we next get a glimpse of her through Jaime's eyes, we don't doubt that she was assaulted by her husband, but Jaime's own memories say, whenever Aerys gave a man to the flames, Queen Rhaella would have a visitor in the night, implying that this type of incident was not at all infrequent. And so we suppose that the memory of the exchange with John Darry comes from another occasion overlaid onto the Chelstead execution.
Whatever the exact details, we can be nearly certain of several things. Aerys was aroused by burning his perceived enemies and assaulted his queen after doing so on more than one occasion. John Darry had left the capital with Rhaegar by the time of Lord Chelstead's execution, and, with the clock of fate ticking, Aerys's fifth and final hand was a low-born pyromancer who happened to share the king's obsession with wildfire. His term of office would be shorter than any other hand since the chaos of the Dance of the Dragons.
And now, let's leave King's Landing balanced on a knife's edge, with wildfire caches placed around the city and the Mad King's intentions seeming to grow more diabolical with each day that brought bad news or no news from the fields of the rebellion. We turn our eyes north as Rhaegar marched his hastily assembled army to meet the rebels in the Riverlands.
We know that the royal army was more numerous than the rebels, consisting of nearly 40,000 men, though only about 400 of those were knights. The rest were free riders, foot soldiers, pikemen, and spearmen, including the famed Dornish spears under the command of Prince Lewin Martell, who made up about a quarter of the numbers. The rest were a mix of reachmen who had peeled off from Mace Tyrell's main body, men from Riverlands houses such as Darry, Rhaegar, and Mooten, who had remained loyal, often due to personal connections with the royal house, and men from the Crownlands, including a sizable contingent of bogs, bruins, and crabs who came from Crackclaw Point to fight for the Dragon Lords.
On the other side, the rebels were a force of unified Northmen, and such houses as had followed their liege lords from the Riverlands, Vale, and Stormlands, including men from House Corbury in the Vale and Granderson in the Stormlands who had previously fought against the rebels. Command of this force, which numbered fewer than Rhaegar's 40,000, was shared between Robert Baratheon, Jon Arryn, Ned Stark, and Hoster Tully, the latter three of whom were now bound by bonds of matrimony following the marriages of Ned Stark and Jon Arryn to Hoster Tully's daughters.
The rebel army had organized itself on the north bank of the ford near the place the river road crossed the King's Road, an area known to readers generally as the Crossroads and which has been a significant location throughout the story. In fact, if we're correct about the events that led to Lyanna's disappearance with Rhaegar all those months ago, Rhaegar was very much returning to the scene of one of the inciting incidents of this war.
Reaching the crossing, Rhaegar made the decision to bring the battle to the rebels on the opposite bank. The rebel army took this action as a signal to advance, and so much of the action of the day would take place in and around the shallow waters of the river crossing. Throughout the story, we hear of many lords who either fought at the Trident or who died there. Sir Lyn Corbray, who had opposed Jon Arryn at Gulltown and been pardoned for it, took up his family's ancestral sword, Lady Forlorn, from his wounded father and led a charge against the Dornish spears, which resulted in him killing an injured Prince Lewin Martell.
We know that Barristan Selmy killed many rebels, including friends of both Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon, while on the rebel side, Lord Jason Mallister killed 3 of Rhaegar's bannermen. Lord Grandison, who had fought against Robert at Summerhall, took a wound fighting for his liege at the Trident. Mors Umber's sons were killed fighting for the rebels, and Lord Wyman Manderley was wounded and saved from death by a knight in his service called Sir Bartimus, who himself lost a leg in the fighting.
While the outcome of the battle would be dramatic and decisive, as with any medieval battle, the real story was the thousands of anonymous men who were summoned to service by their lords for reasons they may or may not have fully understood or comprehended, as we see from the stories of two characters we meet in Brienne of Tarth's viewpoint in A Feast for Crows.
Brienne's travels through the Riverlands make up most of her arc during that novel, and during the course of her journey, she meets a wandering septon called Maribald, who takes her to a place known as the Quiet Isle, where she meets another man, known only as the Elder Brother. While talking with Brienne about her quest to find Sansa Stark, the Elder Brother reveals that he was at the Battle of the Trident, where he fought for Prince Rhaegar, though he adds, "He never knew my name. I could not tell you why I fought for Rhaegar, save that the lord I served a lord who had decided to support the dragon rather than the stag. Had he decided elsewise, I might have been on the other side of the river."
The elder brother tells Brienne the battle was a bloody thing, adding the singers would have us believe it was all Rhaegar and Robert struggling in the stream for a woman both of them claimed to love, but I assure you other men were fighting too. He took several wounds in the battle, an arrow through the thigh and another through his foot, before his horse was killed beneath him. In that moment, all that mattered to him was finding another horse, for as a knight he was ruined without one. Then he took a blow to the head and fell into the river where, quote, "by rights I should have drowned." Instead, he floated downstream with many other bodies of men and animals alike, and no doubt quite a bit of detritus from the battle, helms, swords, and more, until washing up on the shores of the Quiet Isle.
The elder brother refers to his experience at the Trident as a death, and being pulled from the water at the Quiet Isle as a rebirth. Certainly it appears that he was assumed dead, as his body was stripped of arms and armor and even clothing by the victors, and when he arrived on the shores of the isle, he was, quote, "naked as my name day," emphasizing the brutality of even the aftermath of a fiercely fought battle. The effects of war led to his conversion from knight to holy man, and while his story may be unique, his experiences are not.
Earlier, Brienne's travel companion Septon Meribald had revealed that he himself was once a soldier, though much longer ago than the elder brother, who is still a man in his prime. As a very young boy, Meribald followed his brothers to war during the War of the Ninepenny Kings. What he saw there taught him that the true stories of battles were not about fame and glory, nor even about the lords whose grievances or disagreements caused them. The stories that predominate are largely those of the common-born men who are summoned to march beneath a lord's banner, often with no arms or armor, and usually with as little idea as to why they're fighting as the elder brother suggested he had at the Trident.
And so we can imagine that of the nearly 80,000 men who fought under the various shining banners at the Trident, the vast majority of them were those who had answered a summons by their lord and set out imagining adventure and glory with little idea of the reasons for or implications of the conflict itself. And so many fought and many died in the mud at the Trident under those banners, while some few survived. Of the survivors, often suffering from wounds, lack of food, and disease, and separated from the lords and friends whom they had set out with, many of whom may have died. Some broke or ran, forced by circumstances to plunder corpses for food or clothing to survive. Those are collectively the glories of war and the experiences of many and more who fight them, and the Battle of the Trident was no different.
But at the center of the battle, there were two men who knew more or less exactly why they fought, and as in so many tales of war and romance, the reason was a woman. The tide of battle eventually brought Robert Baratheon and Rhaegar Targaryen together in the shallow waters of the crossing, and there the battle was decided. Ned describes the scene in A Game of Thrones. Here's the entire passage.
They had come together at the ford of the Trident while the battle crashed around them, Robert with his war hammer and his great antlered helm, the Targaryen prince armored all in black. On his breastplate was the three-headed dragon of his house, wrought all in rubies that flashed like fire in the sunlight. The waters of the Trident ran red around the hooves of their destriers as they circled and clashed again and again, until at last a crushing blow from Robert's hammer stove in the dragon and the chest beneath it. When Ned had finally come on the scene, Rhaegar lay dead in the stream, while men of both armies scrabbled in the swirling waters for rubies knocked free of his armor.
While the legend around Robert and his mighty warhammer would grow with time, the truth is that the duelists were much more closely matched than the history books might imply. Robert was wounded himself in the contest, and though he struck the winning and deadly blow, he himself was incapacitated in the aftermath.
As Robert was tended to by his maesters, other wounded were looked to, including Sir Barristan Selmy, who was, quote, wounded by arrow, spear, and sword, and was near death when he was brought before Robert. Though Robert was counseled by none other than Roose Bolton to execute the famous knight, Robert sent his own maester to tend to the White Knight's wounds. With John Darry and Lewin Martell dead on the field of battle, Sir Barristan would be the only one of Aerys' 7 besides Jaime Lannister to survive the war, and would later be pardoned and named as the Lord Commander of Robert's Kingsguard.
News of Rhaegar Targaryen's death spread quickly across the battlefield and beyond, and a number of things happened more or less all at once. In the Riverlands, with not only Rhaegar but the rest of his commanders either dead or incapacitated, the royal army broke and fled south, in the direction of King's Landing. With Robert wounded badly enough that he was unable to lead the pursuit, that task was given to Ned Stark, who took his own men and any others that were well enough to join him and gave chase, fully expecting the defeated army to reach the capital ahead of them and barricade themselves behind the strong walls of the city.
Meanwhile, in the west, word reached the Iron Islands of Rhaegar's death. Lord Quelon Greyjoy, who had fought beside Aerys, Tywin Lannister, Hoster Tully, and many more during the War of the Ninepenny Kings, and had been instrumental in a wave of reforms meant to integrate the Iron Islands more fully into the Seven Kingdoms than ever before, had attempted to remain neutral, keeping the Iron Men out of the war so far. But news of the Crown Prince's death led to Quelon's sons convincing their father they must now show their support for the rebels or lose all chance at collecting any spoils from the war, which could include favors bestowed upon them by the victor.
And so the Iron Men, led by Quelon Greyjoy, took 50 ships down the coast to attack the Loyalists in the Reach. While raiding villages along the coast, the Iron Men met with unexpected resistance from the Shield Islands at the mouth of the Manda. The Shield Islanders had longships of their own, and history had taught them to be wary of attack from their island neighbors to the north.
Ultimately, the Ironborn prevailed and captured or sank a number of their challengers' ships, with their own losses being fairly negligible, except for the fact that their own lord and captain, Quelon Greyjoy, was killed in the fighting. Not knowing the intentions of the Westermen under Tywin Lannister, or even of their own liegemen back in the islands, Lord Quelon's sons took their longships and hastened back to Pike, where his eldest son, Balon, claimed the Seastone Chair, an event that would eventually lead to the first significant challenge to Robert Baratheon's reign, though in the moment the Ironborn had appeared to support his cause.
In King's Landing, when word of Rhaegar's death arrived, Jaime Lannister takes up the tale of what happened next. Here's a passage from his bathhouse scene at Harrenhal. When the word reached court, Aerys packed the queen off to Dragonstone with Prince Viserys. Princess Elia would have gone as well, but he forbade it. Somehow he had gotten it into his head that Prince Lewin must have betrayed Rhaegar on the Trident, but he thought he could keep Dorne loyal so long as he kept Elia and Aegon by his side.
And so the queen and Prince Viserys were sent away, with Aerys never knowing that his sister wife was once again pregnant, a result, according to Jaime Lannister, of Aerys's assault on the night of Lord Chelstead's execution. Jaime recalls that the royal party left for the royal keep in the morning, with the queen cloaked and hooded as she and her son entered the royal wheelhouse that was waiting to transport them to the docks. That son would later tell his younger sister, unborn at the time, dramatic stories about a midnight flight to Dragonstone. But since they appear to have gotten well away before the enemy arrived at the gates, we think it's more likely that Jaime Lannister had the details correct, and think the midnight part might have lined up more closely with the royal party's arrival at their ancestral island home than their departure from their seat of power.
In any case, the queen fled, allegedly still bearing the wounds from her husband's most recent assault, but Rhaegar's wife and children were commanded to remain in the capital. With no one to take her part, Elia was forced to stay with the children, the youngest of whom was the new heir to the throne, in a city almost certain to soon be under siege, as hostages to ensure her brother's continued loyalty.
Meanwhile, in the city, Aerys continued to plot with his new hand, Lord Rosart, and his pyromancers. Once again, Jaime tells the tale of the king's intentions. "The traitors want my city," I heard him tell Rosart, "but I'll give them naught but ashes. Let Robert be king over charred bones and cooked meat." The Targaryens never buried their dead, they burned them, and Aerys meant to have the greatest funeral pyre of them all, though, if truth be told, I do not believe he truly expected to die. Like Aerion Brightfire before him, Aerys thought the fire would transform him, that he would rise again, reborn as a dragon, and turn all his enemies to ash.
Of particular interest, there is Aerys' evident assumption that, with his eldest son dead, his cousin Robert would claim the throne if he could. But the Mad King had no intention of allowing that to happen, and perhaps, as Jaime suggests, even had a fevered hope that he would be transformed into a living dragon by the wildfire inferno he had planned.
As we said in our Three Kings episode, Aerys' desperate plan was certainly born from his madness and paranoia, but was also highly likely to have been influenced by dreams of some sort. And it's interesting to think about what the Mad King may have seen in his dreams that led him to believe that he himself would be reborn as a literal dragon. We find it fascinating that these dreams can almost certainly be synced with two significant events, either one of which could have been seen in a dream by the Mad King and grotesquely misinterpreted.
First is the conception of his youngest child, whose existence the king was fated to never know about. 15 years in the future, that child would walk into a funeral pyre and emerge unscathed with 3 living dragons, much as Jaime Lannister suggested Aerys believed he would do in the inferno he intended to make of King's Landing. And second is the birth, in a crumbling watchtower in the south, of Rhaegar's also unknown youngest son. Given the history of Targaryen dragon dreams, especially around births, it's certainly possible the king could have seen this event in a dream and misinterpreted it as a literal dragon hatching.
And of course, the third option is that Aerys could have dreamed of both events, with the results being highly deceiving and dangerous to a king consumed by madness and paranoia who had no knowledge of the existence of either of those 2 Targaryen offspring. In any case, while both of these things did happen, Aerys would not live to understand them, for the final thing that happened in the wake of Rhaegar's death was that Tywin Lannister finally decided to enter the fray.
And so, in our final segment of this episode, we'll look at what happened when the army of the West arrived at the gates of King's Landing, bringing with it the final bitter end of House Targaryen's grasp on Aegon the Dragon's Iron Throne and his mighty fortress city on the banks of the Blackwater.
Your brother Rhaegar was the last dragon, and he died on the Trident.
Earlier, we mentioned that Aerys had been convinced by Rhaegar to send messages to Lord Tywin Lannister and that no reply had arrived. But we also suggested that the lack of response did not indicate a lack of action. In fact, as it happened, a mere fortnight after Rhaegar's death, Tywin Lannister appeared at the gates of King's Landing with an army of 12,000 Westermen.
The timing supports what we suggested earlier, that Tywin had indeed marshaled his army following Aerys' pleading summons and had marched east. We suspect as far as the border of the Riverlands, where the foothills of the Western Mountains could give him cover. Perhaps he himself lodged with one of his loyal bannermen, such as the Liddens of Deepden, who appear to possess the furthest east stronghold of the Westerlands. There he could await news of the battle to come and then break cover, presenting himself as an ally to the victor.
And so when news from the Trident arrived, likely within days of the battle, the board was set and Tywin Lannister marched east. Jaime Lannister confirms that his father had waited for that news when he tells Brienne in A Storm of Swords, "My father had held back from the war, brooding on all the wrongs Aerys had done him and determined that House Lannister should be on the winning side. The Trident decided him."
But Lord Tywin wasn't ready to openly declare his allegiance just yet. Arriving at the gates and finding them closed, Tywin declared his loyalty to Aerys. As Jaime would recall, Ned Stark was racing south with Robert's van, but my father's forces reached the city first. Pycelle convinced the king that his Warden of the West had come to defend him, so he opened the gates. Inside the city, Aerys' two closest counselors had been at odds, with Varys the Spider warning the king to keep the gates closed, and Grand Maester Pycelle arguing that the Warden of the West had at last come to his aid.
Of course, Aerys, beset by tragedy and mad with fear and paranoia, neglected to recall that Pycelle, who was advising him to open the gates, had also been a long-time ally and admirer of Lord Tywin during the nearly 20 years they served together on Aerys' small council. As Pycelle would confess to Tyrion in A Clash of Kings, "Your Lord Father, ask him, I was ever his true servant. 'Twas I who bid Aerys open his gates."
While this confession took Tyrion by surprise, Jaime had no illusions, as he would tell Brienne the one time Aerys should have heeded Varys, and he ignored him. Pycelle himself would go on to confess to Tyrion that the realm needed a king. I prayed it should be your good father, but Robert was too strong, and Lord Stark moved too swiftly.
And so we see the outlines of what Tywin Lannister might have planned or hoped for with his swift march to take the capital ahead of Robert Baratheon's forces. Given what happened next, we believe that, as Jaime himself suggested, Tywin had carefully laid plans to come out on top no matter who the victor had been at the Trident. If Rhaegar had won, we suggest Tywin would have marched for the capital, subdued any resistance, and presented the victorious prince with his throne. But given Tywin's long-time ambitions to see his maiden daughter Cersei wed to the crown prince, we might even go so far as to suggest that Tywin planned to get rid of Elia and perhaps her children and Aerys, no matter what the outcome of the battle had been.
Yeah, it's easy to see how he could have passed their deaths off as the unfortunate acts of a rebel plot, which he, of course, had arrived in time to punish, but not in time to foil. Tywin would look a hero of sorts. A grateful prince would take Cersei to wife, reinstate the Warden of the West as his hand, and all would live happily ever after. But given Rhaegar's death, Tywin's mandate in the capital became a bit more straightforward: kill all the Targaryens and install a new king on the Iron Throne.
While Pycelle's comment, Robert was too strong and Lord Stark moved too swiftly, hints at Tywin's secret ambition as to who the new king might be, the reality would be somewhat different. Because immediately behind the army of the West would come the Northmen and their allies, having raced south from the Trident in an effort to catch up with the remnants of Rhaegar's army before they could barricade themselves in the capital.
In A Game of Thrones, Ned Stark's thoughts indicate a similar sentiment to Jaime's. Aerys Targaryen must have thought his gods had answered his prayers when Lord Tywin Lannister appeared before the gates of King's Landing with an army 12,000 strong, professing loyalty. So the Mad King had ordered his last mad act. He had opened his city to the lions at the gate.
Ned goes on to recall the troubling details of what he encountered when he arrived, speaking of treachery and dishonor, and thinking of how dreams of the scenes he saw still haunted his sleep years later. In A Storm of Swords, Jorah Mormont, who was with Ned that day, tells Daenerys Targaryen, "I saw King's Landing after the sack. Babes were butchered that day as well, and old men and children at play. More women were raped than you can count."
All this began to play out as soon as the gates opened to the Westermen, though Maester Yandel offers a more sanitized version of events. Lord Tywin's cause was that of the realms, and he was determined to bring an end to the reign that madness had brought low. Once within the walls of the city, his soldiers assaulted the defenders of King's Landing, and blood ran red in the streets. A hand-picked cadre of men raced to the Red Keep to storm its walls and seek out King Aerys so that justice might be done.
The hand-picked cadre of men included Gregor Clegane and Armory Lorch, who Tyrion thinks of as his father's hellhounds. But there were others as well, including Sir Ellis Westerling and Lord Roland Craycall, son of the man whom Jaime had spent years squiring for before earning his knighthood. While this group fought their way into the Red Keep, the lone Kingsguard in the city, who had been nominally tasked with its defence, took certain matters into his own hands.
Earlier, after Rhaella and Viserys had been sent away, Jaime had heard Aerys give Rossard his final orders, which we mentioned earlier. "The traitors want my city, but I'll give them naught but ashes. Let Robert be king over charred bones and cooked meat." With his father's men spilling into the city, Jaime knew that the royal cause was lost and, quote, sent to Aerys asking him leave to make terms. The reply came back in the form of a royal command: "Bring me your father's head if you are no traitor."
Jaime's messenger also gave him one other critical piece of information, that Lord Rossard was with the king. As he would say to Brienne years later, "I knew what that meant." And so Jaime, dressed in the golden armour of a Lannister, sought out the pyromancer. He found him, quote, dressed as a common man-at-arms, hurrying to a postern gate, and slew him. He later recalls that Rossard resisted, though, quote, if truth be told, he fought like an alchemist, and was no match for the young Kingsguard.
That done, Jaime headed for the throne room to find Aerys. The king was there, alone, pacing and nervously picking at the scabs left on his hands by the sharp edges of his throne. When he saw Jaime, bloody sword in hand, he demanded to know if it was Lord Tywin's blood, saying, "I want him dead, the traitor. I want his head. You'll bring me his head, or you'll burn with all the rest. All the traitors. Rossard says they're inside the walls. He's gone to make them a warm welcome. Whose blood? Whose?"
While exactly how Aerys thought anyone would survive Rossard's warm welcome is a question neither we nor Jaime can answer. Jaime's answer to the king's question about the blood on his sword was brief and to the point: Rossard's. And it was at that point that Aerys Targaryen understood that the end had come, and there would be no salvation and no rebirth through fire. It says, "Those purple eyes grew huge then, and the royal mouth drooped open in shock. He lost control of his bowels, turned, and ran for the Iron Throne. Beneath the empty eyes of the skulls on the walls, Jaime hauled the last Dragon King bodily off the steps, squealing like a pig and smelling like a privy. A single slash across his throat was all it took to end it. So easy," he remembered thinking. "A king should die harder than this."
It was, thought Jaime, somewhat unfortunate that at that moment a number of his father's knights entered the room, including Ellis Westerling and Roland Craycall. A few moments more and Jaime could have vanished through the king's door behind the throne and left someone else to take the blame, or credit, for killing the Mad King. As it was, he listened to the news that his father's men had all but subdued the city and the castle and offered a single order, signifying his transition from Aerys' Kingsguard in command of the defenses to whatever came after. "Tell them the Mad King is dead. Spare all those who yield and hold them captive."
When Craycall asked if he should proclaim a new king, Jaime knew he wanted to know who the new king would be, in that moment giving Jaime the opportunity to not only be a kingslayer, but a kingmaker, like his predecessor in the White Brotherhood, Sir Criston Cole. Briefly, Jaime considered the options. His father, Lord Tywin. Robert Baratheon, victor of the rebellion and slayer of Prince Rhaegar. Or perhaps one of Aerys' own blood, Prince Viserys or the infant Aegon. That seemed to appeal for a moment as he thought, a new Targaryen king and my father as hand. How the wolves will howl and the Stormlord choke with rage.
But, acknowledging to himself the possibility of tainted blood in both of the Targaryen children, Jaime suddenly found himself unwilling to take on the role of kingmaker. "Proclaim who you bloody well like," it says he told Craycall, after which, quote, "he climbed the Iron Throne and seated himself with his sword across his knees to see who would come to claim the kingdom." As it happened, it had been Eddard Stark.
Jaime's memories of what was happening while the events in the throne room played out are obviously the knowledge of hindsight, as he thinks Targaryen loyalists were still dying on the Serpentine steps and in the armory. Gregor Clegane and Armory Lorch were scaling the walls of Maegor's Holdfast, and Ned Stark was leading his Northmen through the King's Gate even then. But it is made clear that Jaime knew that Elia and her children were in Maegor's and that he did nothing in that moment to see to their safety.
Yeah, let's turn our attention briefly to what was happening outside the throne room. As we said, eyewitness accounts report a brutal sacking of the city, with Jorah telling Daenerys by way of explanation, "There is a savage beast in every man, and when you hand that man a sword or spear and send him forth to war, the beast stirs. The scent of blood is all it takes to wake him."
And certainly two of those savage beasts were making their way into the royal residence, even as Jaime killed the king and sat on his throne to see who would come to claim it. In A Storm of Swords, Tyrion Lannister tells Prince Oberyn Martell what happened inside Maegor's Holdfast that day, with brutal simplicity. Sir Armory dragged Princess Rhaenys out from under her father's bed and stabbed her to death. He had some men-at-arms with him, but I do not know their names. It was Sir Gregor Clegane who smashed Prince Aegon's head against a wall and raped your sister Elia with his blood and brains still on his hands.
Tyrion, who was too young to be present during the sack, knew this information in part due to a conversation he'd had with his father some weeks earlier, though it's also heavily implied that in the aftermath of the rebellion, it was common knowledge around Casterly Rock. In A Storm of Swords, Tywin tells his youngest son that he planned to pin all the blame for the murders of Rhaegar's wife and children on Sir Amory Lorch, who has since died during the War of the Five Kings.
This obviously is not precisely true, as Tywin tells Tyrion, "It was Sir Armory who brought me the girl's body, if you must know. He found her hiding under her father's bed, as if she believed Rhaegar could still protect her. Princess Elia and the babe were in the nursery a floor below." Tywin confirms that it was he who issued the orders to find and kill Rhaegar's children when he says, "I grant you, it was done too brutally. Elia need not have been harmed at all. That was sheer folly. By herself, she was nothing." And then, in response to Tyrion's questioning why Gregor Clegane would kill a royal princess, Tywin shrugs and brushes it off, saying, "Because I did not tell him to spare her. I doubt I mentioned her at all."
Essentially, Tywin excuses the brutality of the murders by denying foreknowledge of just how bestial the mountain truly was and saying of Lorch, the blood was in him. In the World Book, Maester Yandel's highly sanitized version of events, it is suggested that, quote, "those who ravished and murdered Princess Elia escaped justice," adding that, "nor is it known who murdered Princess Rhaenys in her bed or smashed the infant Aegon's head against a wall."
Yandel even goes so far as to suggest that perhaps Aerys had ordered the murders, and even repeats the rumour that Elia had murdered her own children, though he offers no alternate theory for who then murdered her. Yandel also reports the deaths of Rosart and Aerys, though he places Aerys last in the list, and of Jaime Lannister merely says, "Sir Jaime did as he thought best for the realm, bringing an end to the Mad King."
In A Clash of Kings, Jaime has a dream in which he meets Rhaegar and several of his brothers of the Kingsguard. It's a dream born from his guilt, and in it, Rhaegar approaches him, burning with a cold light, now white, now red, now dark, and says accusingly, "I left my wife and children in your hands." Desperate to make himself understood by the man who he had once admired so much, Jaime says desperately, "I never thought he'd hurt them. I was with the king."
What Jaime wishes he could tell Rhaegar is what Aerys was planning, and that he did what he thought he had to do to save the city, which in his mind included Rhaegar's family. That he, who Jaime never dreamed would hurt a woman and her children, is his father, and in this assumption Jaime reveals his own youthful naivety and perhaps ignorance of his father's history.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible that Jaime never knew of the rivalry between Tywin and the Princess of Dorne over Rhaegar's marriage, which at best led to Tywin forgetting to mention to his hellhounds that they need not, and in fact should not, harm the Dornish princess, and at worst was the cause of a direct order Tywin denied giving. But it's very hard to believe that Jaime grew up at Casterly Rock and never heard about the reigns of Castamere, who were brutally extinguished, man, woman, and child, by his father a mere 20 years previously.
And so, while perhaps there can be some excusing the murder of Aerys as what had to be done, it's very hard to find any excuses for Jaime's failure to immediately seek to safeguard Elia and her children, who he knew to be sheltering in Maegor's holdfast in the aftermath of Aerys' death. The only reason, which is not an excuse, seems to be that in that moment of murdering the king he had sworn to protect, Jaime Lannister completely abdicated his duty to the remnants of House Targaryen.
Funnily enough, much later, Jaime will tell Brienne that the reason he never told anyone what Aerys was plotting, or who killed Rosart and his assistants, who Jaime hunted down in the days following the sack, is that he had sworn to keep the king's secrets. If true, it seems some part of his brain tried to retain a shred of honor by remaining true to at least one of the vows he had made that long ago day at Harrenhal.
Before we go on to the immediate aftermath of the sack and the conclusion of the episode, we want to get back to two characters who we promised earlier to look more closely at and who were present in King's Landing that day: The first is Varys the Spider, who was apparently the only person who advised Aerys not to open the gates to his old friend Tywin. But can we discern what his goal was in that moment?
Well, on the face of it, what motivates Lord Varys is perhaps one of the most opaque plot lines of the war, second only to what happened with Lyanna Stark after her disappearance. In the lead up to the war, Varys, like Jaime, is characterized as always being at Aerys' side, though unlike Jaime, as Master of Whispers, he was also whispering in the king's ear. Later, Sir Barristan Selmy would tell Stannis Baratheon that the rot in King Aerys' reign began with Varys, and so let's consider what exactly Varys' goals were at this time.
If we take it as a given that Varys is Blackfyre adjacent, then the destruction of the ruling branch of House Targaryen would seem to be his goal. In which case, an attempt to save Aerys from the lion at the gate makes little sense, and appearing to ignore the wildfire plot makes even less sense. Unless we take the viewpoint that Varys was plotting more than vengeance, and instead backed a Blackfyre resurgence that was as yet unripe in 282 AC. As such, he may have wanted to keep the Iron Throne weak, its occupant easily manipulated, and the country in clear decay under the Targaryen dynasty, until he was ready to make his move.
That's right. Remember that overheard conversation between Varys and Illyrio in Arya 2 of Game of Thrones, in which Varys tells his partner in plotting that the wolf and the lion would soon be at each other's throats? And Illyrio replied, "Too soon, too soon. What good is war now? We are not ready. Delay."
That is a very strong statement about the nature of their plot, which almost certainly have changed in specifics with the years and events between 282 and 299 AC, but has nonetheless likely always been about destabilization. In fact, if we accept that the same precept of too soon delay applied as equally in 282 as it did in 299, it may be the most compelling hint that Varys did not in fact save the Targaryen heir during the sack, but already had his own Aegon hidden away in Essos, waiting for the next step of the intricate plot that would one day bring the famed boy to Westeros.
Whether Varys was scurrying about swapping infants in the Red Keep obviously remains a hotly debated topic both within the fandom and the fictional world, to which only time will give us the answer. But we're pretty sure that whatever his machinations may have been, it was not in Varys' interest to see a strong king supported by someone like Tywin Lannister upon the Iron Throne.
On that, we think we can all agree, so let's look at the second person who was in the capital that day who we think is worthy of a closer look. Earlier we mentioned that Ethan Glover was the only one of Brandon Stark's companions who had been left alive by Aerys, who had the others all murdered along with their fathers. Whether this was because his father had not arrived in King's Landing, or the king's interest turned elsewhere once Jon Arryn defied him, is never mentioned. From a purely meta standpoint, we suggest that Ethan survived because George needed him to survive.
And why would that be, you might ask? Well, we note with great interest that in the aftermath of the sack, nearly every person who might have spoken with Rhaegar in King's Landing about the location of the three King's Guards and Lyanna Stark during this time period was either dead or absent from the city. Because we have Jaime Lannister's viewpoint, as we mentioned earlier, it seems as though he had been kept in the dark. But a single Stark bannerman, kept conveniently alive in the black cells for nearly a year, might have been exactly what Rhaegar and the author needed in order to pass a message to Ned Stark, just in case the battle in the Riverlands didn't go as he hoped.
And so our idea is that Ethan Glover survived in order to tell Ned where he would find his sister. And as we'll see in the next installment of this topic, it will turn out that Ethan did indeed accompany his liege lord into the south and later into the Red Mountains of Dawn with a very small and select group of companions. For now, we leave Ethan Glover newly freed from his long imprisonment and turn our attention back to the Iron Throne.
Jaime later recalls Ned Stark's arrival in the throne room with the anger of hindsight. Ned recalls it as well and describes the scene to Robert in A Game of Thrones. I rode the length of the hall in silence between the long rows of dragon skulls. It felt as though they were watching me somehow. I stopped in front of the throne, looking up at Jaime. His golden sword was across his legs, its edge red with a king's blood. My men were filling the room behind me. Lannister's men drew back. I never said a word. I looked at him seated there on the throne, and I waited. At last Jaime laughed and got up. He took off his helm and he said to me, "Have no fear, Stark. I was only keeping it warm for our friend Robert. It's not a very comfortable seat, I'm afraid."
Ned Stark would never accept that Jaime had done what was necessary, asserting to the end that his broken vow was the only detail that mattered in that instant. And an interesting thing in that scene is Jaime's deferral to Robert, who wasn't even present. As the rebellion wore on, it had become clear that Robert Baratheon would claim the throne of his cousins if he could, and Jaime Lannister, with a chance to claim the throne for his father or to remind Ned that there were still Targaryens living whose claims would take precedence, chose instead to offer the throne to Robert, which certainly didn't help Ned's impressions of the young man as an oathbreaker.
As for Robert, injured as he was, it would take some days for him to reach the city, by which time it had been thoroughly subdued. When he did arrive and sat the Iron Throne for the first time, Tywin Lannister bent his knee to the new king and presented a token of his loyalty. In A Storm of Swords, he tells Tyrion, "We had come late to Robert's cause. It was necessary to demonstrate our loyalty. When I laid those bodies before the throne, no man could doubt that we had forsaken House Targaryen forever, and Robert's relief was palpable. As stupid as he was, even he knew that Rhaegar's children had to die if his throne was ever to be secure. Yet he saw himself as a hero, and heroes do not kill children."
Ned Stark never forgot that moment, and it seems dreamed of it often. In his dreams, he saw, quote, "the bodies beneath the Iron Throne, wrapped in the crimson cloaks of Tywin's houseguard. That was clever of him. The blood did not show so badly against the red cloth. The little princess had been barefoot, still dressed in a bedgown. And the boy. Later, Sir Kevin Lannister would recall the scene in similar fashion. The bodies of Prince Rhaegar's children at the foot of the Iron Throne, wrapped up in crimson cloaks. The girl had been recognizably the Princess Rhaenys, but the boy, a faceless horror of bone and brain and gore, a few hanks of fair hair. None of us looked long. Tywin said that it was Prince Aegon, and we took him at his word.
Years later, Barristan Selmy would think with revulsion of the same scene, which he did not personally witness due to the injuries he had suffered at the Trident. He wonders about Robert's reaction and thinks, "If I had seen him smile over the red ruins of Rhaegar's children, no army on this earth could have stopped me from killing him." Barristan, like Ned, drew a firm line at the murder of children, a debate that would arise again years later in A Game of Thrones when the two men served on Robert's small council together.
In King's Landing in 282 AC, Ned witnessed the scene with fury and disgust. In A Game of Thrones, he thinks back on the moment and recalls, quote, "the angry words they had exchanged when Tywin Lannister had presented Robert with the corpses of Rhaegar's wife and children as a token of fealty. The only mention that Elya's body was also laid out along with her children, gifts for the new king. Ned called those 3 deaths murder, while Robert declared it was only war. Ned's protest that the children were no more than babes led to a response that is one of the coldest lines in the series. I see no babes, only dragon spawn.
Afterwards, it says, not even Jon Arryn had been able to calm that storm. With the 2 friends who had fought together for nearly a year to take down the Mad King, risking everything they had in the name of justice, at such odds, it seems likely that all Lord Jon could do was devise a way to separate them. And so, it says, Eddard Stark had ridden out that very day in a cold rage to fight the last battles of the war alone in the south.
Ned would take his men to Storm's End, still held under siege by Lords Mace Tyrell and Paxter Redwyne, and as we said, he would be joined by his brother's companion Ethan Glover, newly released from the Black Cells. And here we will leave the story, with Robert sitting the Iron Throne, Jon Arryn at his side, no doubt surrounded by those who, like Tywin Lannister, were entirely too eager to ensure their place in the new era.
When we return with part 2, we'll cover everything that happened when Ned went into the south, as well as the fates of the last remaining Targaryens on Dragonstone, and what happened in King's Landing as Robert established his reign there. In conclusion, we leave you with the words of Maester Yandel in his book that was obsequiously dedicated to Robert Baratheon. The first half of the passage is, without a doubt, true, though you may decide for yourself the veracity of the latter half. And so ended both the reign of House Targaryen and Robert's Rebellion, the war that put an end to nearly 300 years of Targaryen rule and ushered in a new golden era under the auspices of House Baratheon. Thanks so much for joining us today. As usual, we'll end the episode by giving credit where credit is due. Thanks to George R.R. Martin for providing such fascinating backstory to his saga, and to Kevin MacLeod for allowing us to use his music in our production. And now it's time to thank our patrons from the Castle Steel level. If you enjoy the podcast, consider being a patron, and you could be hearing your name here too. Our most heartfelt thanks to Tori Loon, AJ, Egg on the Sixth, Ali B, Sir Brennan of House Lawton, Carlos the Mesquite Maester, Casey, Cassandra, Lady Amalthea, Chris, Christian, Courtney, David, Darian, Dimitri B, Dennis, Lady Diana Dane, Emily of the Eyrie, Ezra, Liza, Septon Pat, Gerald Garcia, Sir Gladworth, Sir Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Honeybee, Something Like a Lawyer, Jim McGeehan, Red Jimba Rivers, John Aris, Rider of the Ice Dragon, Sonarion, the White Storm, Jordan G, Judson, Katie, Tree Girl, Ann Hayden Jones and her husband Pip, Lauren, Lemba, Lomas Knight Rider, survivor of the Yeen Sleepover, Mage Marmot, Monero Geek TV, Maria, Margarita, and our cohort of Matts, Matt A, Matt C, Matt F, Matt K, Matt L, Matt M, Matt R, and Matt S, as well as Beatrix Rainfall, Molly, Nimble Nick One Iric, Paul B, Paul H, PJ, Peter, King Ray, first of his name, Rickle Pickle, Sam, Sir Swift the Peppered Knight from the House of Black and Grey, Sir Larcelot of Bee Hill, Cern, the Rat Chef de Cuisine, Terry, Steph Lioness, Vince, Quarren Halfhand, Yvonne, and welcome to Sir J. Duncan the Tall. As always, let us know if I've pronounced any of your names wrong, if you have a nickname you'd prefer to use, or if you feel we've left anything out.